Everyone in the room received extravagant gifts, but me. My mother smirked, looking down her nose as she handed out luxury boxes. "Oh, I must have forgotten yours," she announced to the silent room. They all expected me to break down, to run away crying like I always did. Instead, I just grinned, took a slow sip of my red wine, and said, "It is completely fine. Check out what I got for myself." The entire room went dead still when they saw what I threw onto the mahogany table. My name is Gemma. I am 33 years old, and for as long as I can remember, I have been the designated failure of my family. Before I tell you how I burned their perfect facade to the ground on Christmas night, let me know where you are watching from in the comments below. Hit that like button and subscribe if you have ever had to stand up to a toxic family who completely underestimated your worth. Growing up in a wealthy suburb of Connecticut meant appearances were absolutely everything. My parents, Richard and Brenda, spent their entire lives cultivating the image of the perfect affluent American family. We lived in a sprawling colonial mansion with manicured hedges and a massive circular driveway. What nobody outside those walls knew, and what my parents desperately tried to hide, was that the house was heavily mortgaged and constantly on the brink of foreclosure. My father, Richard, was 62 years old and ran a chain of local restaurants that was barely breaking even, but you would never know it by looking at them. They wore designer clothes, drove luxury cars, and threw parties that cost more than my college tuition. It was Christmas Eve, the crown jewel of my mother Brenda and her social calendar. The living room was decorated like a magazine cover with a 12-foot tree covered in expensive crystal ornaments. The fireplace roared, and the champagne flowed freely among the guests. I sat on the edge of the velvet sofa holding a glass of red wine, watching the annual display of favoritism unfold right in front of me. My younger sister Madison sat across from me. At 31 years old, she was the undisputed golden child. She had always been given the best of everything, from private tutors to a lavish wedding paid for entirely by my parents. Next to her sat her husband Terrence. Terrence is 34, an African-American real estate bro who never missed an opportunity to talk about his supposed multi-million-dollar property deals. He wore tailored suits and spoke with a booming confidence that my parents absolutely adored. They thought he was the perfect son-in-law, a wealthy visionary who matched their fake elite status perfectly. The gift exchange was the main event of the night. Brenda, who was 60 years old but fought aging with expensive treatments she could not actually afford, stood by the tree playing the role of the generous matriarch. She handed a heavy rectangular box to Terrence. He tore off the wrapping paper and let out a loud, boastful laugh. It was a Rolex watch. He held it up for the room to see, thanking Richard and Brenda, loudly acting as if he was completely accustomed to such lavish tributes. Next, my mother handed an oversized orange box to Madison. My sister gasped dramatically as she pulled out a genuine Hermes bag. She paraded it around the living room, modeling it on her arm, while my parents beamed with intense pride. "You deserve the best, sweetie," my father Richard said, his chest puffed out with artificial confidence. I sat there in complete silence. I had brought them thoughtful, expensive gifts, which were currently sitting unopened under the tree. I waited for my turn, though I already knew the script. I had lived it for my entire life. My mother brushed her hands together, took a sip of her champagne, and looked around the room as if taking inventory. Then she let her eyes fall on me. The festive chatter in the room began to quiet down. "Oh, Gemma," my mother said, her voice unnaturally loud, so that the extended family members and guests gathered in the adjoining dining room could easily hear. "I must have forgotten your gift this year. With all the chaos of shopping for Madison and Terrence, it just slipped my mind entirely." A few uncomfortable chuckles echoed from the hallway. I kept my face perfectly neutral. "That is okay, Mom," I said calmly. "I really do not need anything." But Brenda was not finished. She never was. She took a step closer to me, her eyes gleaming with that familiar, cruel satisfaction. "Well, let us be honest," she continued, her tone dripping with mock pity. "You are just a regular office worker. Even if I had bought you a designer bag or a nice watch, you would have nowhere to wear it. Nobody expects a low-level employee to look glamorous. It would just be a waste of good money on someone who cannot appreciate true luxury anyway. The living room went dead silent. The crackle of the fireplace suddenly sounded incredibly loud. Terrence let out a low chuckle, leaning back on the sofa and crossing his arms, clearly enjoying the show. Madison pretended to inspect her fingernails, hiding a smirk behind her hand. My father Richard stood by the bar, swirling the ice in his Scotch glass, not saying a single word to defend his own daughter. They were all waiting. They were waiting for my voice to shake. They were waiting for my eyes to well up with tears. They wanted me to grab my coat, offer a pathetic apology for ruining the mood, and run out the front door into the cold December night, so they could spend the rest of the evening talking about how overly sensitive and unsuccessful I was. Just 5 years ago, I would have crumbled under the weight of her words. Back then, Brenda had manipulated me into taking out a massive high-interest loan to pay for her supposed urgent medical surgery. I ruined my credit and worked double shifts to pay it off, only to find out she used that money for cosmetic procedures to look good at Madison and Terrence's wedding. They bled me dry and discarded me like trash. But those years of hardship did not break me. They forged me into someone untouchable. I was no longer the vulnerable girl who cried in her bedroom while they celebrated without me. I was not the desperate daughter who begged for their approval or financial help. They thought I was drowning in student debt and barely scraping by in life. They thought I was the exact same failure they had always labeled me to be. They had absolutely no idea who was actually sitting on their couch, and they were about to learn a very hard lesson about underestimating the family scapegoat. I did not cry. I did not shrink into the upholstery or look down at my hands in shame. Instead, I leaned back against the plush velvet cushions and let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face. I lifted my wine glass, holding it up to the warm light of the chandelier, and took a long, calm sip. The silence in the room stretched out, becoming heavy and suffocating. They were waiting for the break, but the break never came. Terrence, sensing the uncomfortable shift in the atmosphere, decided to play the loyal son-in-law. He adjusted his expensive designer cuffs and let out a booming laugh that sounded entirely forced. "Come on," Brenda Terrence said, waving his hand in my direction. "Do not be too hard on her. Not everyone has what it takes to make it in the real world. Some people are just destined to fetch coffee and push papers for the rest of their lives. We cannot all be wealthy visionaries, right, Gemma?" He flashed a brilliant white smile, looking around the room for validation from the extended family. Madison giggled and leaned into his shoulder, practically glowing with second-hand arrogance. My father, Richard, offered a tight nod of agreement, taking another sip of his expensive scotch. "That is right," Terrence Richard muttered, looking at me with pure disdain. "The world needs followers too. We just wish she had applied herself more instead of settling for mediocrity." I lowered my glass and rested it on my knee. I looked directly at Terrence, then shifted my cold gaze to my mother. "You are absolutely right, Mom," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the massive living room and echoing into the dining area where the rest of the relatives sat. "I definitely do not have a designer wardrobe or a luxury watch to show off tonight. But then again, I suppose my disposable income went toward other highly pressing family matters a few years ago." Brenda frowned, her perfectly shaped eyebrows pulling together in sudden confusion. "What on earth are you talking about?" she snapped, her pleasant host facade cracking slightly. "Do not start making up crazy stories just because your feelings are hurt." I stood up slowly, smoothing the fabric of my simple dress. "I am talking about the $50,000 personal loan I took out for you exactly 5 years ago," I said, keeping my tone conversational as if we were discussing the winter weather. "You remember that, right, Mom? The life-or-death emergency cyst removal surgery you desperately needed. The one you claimed our medical insurance refused to cover. The one where you drove to my cheap studio apartment, sat on my floor, and sobbed uncontrollably, begging me to save your life because you thought you were going to die." A sudden collective gasp rippled through the dining room. My Aunt Patricia, who had been quietly eating a holiday appetizer, froze with her fork halfway to her mouth. Uncle George turned entirely around in his heavy wooden chair to stare at us, his jaw dropping. Brenda went completely rigid. The color drained from her face, leaving only the bright slash of her red lipstick. That was a highly private medical matter, Brenda hissed, her voice dropping to a frantic, trembling whisper. How dare you bring that up in front of company on Christmas Eve? Because it was not a medical matter at all, was it, Mom? I challenged, taking a confident step toward the center of the room. It was a cosmetic matter. I ruined my credit score for half a decade to secure that cash. I took on a predatory subprime loan with a brutal interest rate. I worked double shifts on weekends and holidays just to make the minimum monthly payments so my accounts would not go into collections. I ate cheap ramen noodles for dinner and walked miles to work in the freezing snow to save bus fare because I genuinely thought I was keeping my mother alive. But you did not have a dangerous cyst removed. You had a premium lower facelift and an expensive neck lift. The room erupted into shocked whispers. Guests exchanged horrified glances. Madison dropped her hand from Terence, her eyes widening in disbelief. But I was not finished. I kept my voice steady and loud enough to cut through the rising murmurs. And the rest of that $50,000, I continued locking eyes with my sister. That went straight to funding the ridiculous custom ice sculptures, the premium open bar, and the imported floral arrangements for Madison and Terrence's luxury wedding. You stole my financial stability to buy yourself a new face, and to impress your wealthy country club friends at your golden child's reception. You drained my bank accounts so you could pretend to be high society. Liar. Brenda shrieked at the top of her lungs. Her composure shattered into a million pieces. Her face turned a violent shade of crimson, clashing horribly with her elegant holiday dress. You are a jealous, vindictive liar. She pointed a trembling, manicured finger at me, her entire body shaking with rage. How dare you come into my house and ruin Christmas with your sick, psychotic delusions? You have always been insanely jealous of your sister. You have always hated that Terrence is a successful businessman who provides a beautiful life for her, while you have absolutely nothing to your name. Richard slammed his scotch glass down on the wooden bar cart, hard enough to make the crystal ring loudly. That is enough, Gemma, he roared, stepping aggressively forward to shield his wife from the stares of the guests. You will not stand in my living room and hurl wild, fabricated accusations at your mother. You are completely ungrateful and mentally unstable. We gave you a roof over your head for 18 years, and this is how you repay our kindness. By inventing vicious lies to humiliate us in front of our respected guests. You are a total disgrace to this family. You should be deeply ashamed of yourself. The extended family was completely silent now, watching the absolute implosion of the perfect family image my parents had spent decades carefully building. Nobody touched their food. Nobody took a sip of their drinks. Brenda, realizing that her anger was making her look worse, suddenly shifted tactics. She began to force fake tears, pressing a hand against her chest and playing the ultimate wounded victim. I did everything for her. Brenda wailed to the room at large, squeezing her eyes shut to produce tears. I sacrificed my whole life for this ungrateful girl, and she comes here tonight to destroy us out of pure spite. She is crazy. She needs serious psychiatric help. Terrence stepped forward, puffing out his chest, trying to intimidate me. Listen to me, you pathetic failure, Terrence barked, pointing at the door. You need to leave right now before I throw you out myself. You are ruining my wife's holiday. I did not flinch. I did not step back. I looked at Terrence and let out a cold, sharp laugh that echoed through the tense room. I am not going anywhere, I replied. Not until I finish giving out my Christmas presents. I completely ignored my mother's theatrical crying and Terrence's threatening posture. Their anger was like meaningless background noise to me now. I maintained absolute eye contact with my father as I slowly unclasped my designer handbag. The bag itself was a limited edition piece that cost more than my parents' entire mortgage balance, but naturally none of them possessed the sophisticated taste required to recognize it. I reached inside and my fingers brushed against the smooth, cool surface of a thick leather envelope. I pulled it out. It was a rich burgundy color sealed with a heavy gold wax stamp. I held it up for a fraction of a second, ensuring every single eye in the living room was locked onto it. Then with a sharp flick of my wrist, I tossed it onto the glass coffee table. It landed with a heavy definitive thud right next to Terrence's fake Rolex box and Madison's gaudy orange designer bag. "Go ahead, Dad," I offered, gesturing toward the table with an open palm. "Open your Christmas present." I know Mom loudly announced that she forgot my gift, but I certainly did not forget to bring something for the family to look at tonight. Richard stared at the burgundy envelope as if it were a live explosive device ticking down in his living room. He looked at Brenda, who had abruptly stopped her fake sobbing to stare at the table. He looked at Terrence, whose chest-puffing bravado had slightly deflated out of sheer unadulterated curiosity. Finally, my father's insatiable greed won the battle. It always did. He took 2 heavy steps forward, his expensive leather shoes sinking into the Persian rug, and snatched the envelope from the glass surface. He broke the wax seal with a sharp crack and pulled out a stack of crisp, thick legal documents. The room was so utterly silent you could hear the heavy paper rustling in his hands. I watched his eyes dart back and forth across the top page. I watched the exact second his brain registered the official state seals, the notarized signatures, and the heavy black bold font printed at the top of the deed. His face turned a sickly, ashen shade of gray. The deep wrinkles around his eyes seemed to deepen aggressively as he read the numbers. "What is this?" Richard asked Brenda, stepping closer and clutching his arm, her sharp manicured nails digging into his suit jacket. "Read it aloud, Dad," I instructed, my voice cutting through the heavy, suffocating silence like a scalpel. "Tell the entire room what your ungrateful failure of a daughter just brought to Christmas dinner." Richard swallowed hard. His hands began to tremble so violently that the thick legal paper shook, making a soft rattling sound. "It is a property deed," he whispered, his voice entirely devoid of its usual booming, authoritative arrogance. "It is a warranty deed for a residential estate." Madison let out a confused scoff from the sofa. "A house?" she asked, crossing her arms defensively. "Who buys a house and brings the deed to a holiday party?" "Where is it located, Richard?" my mother demanded, her voice pitching higher with intense impatience and growing dread. "Aspen, Colorado," my father choked out, reading directly from the legal description. "It is a luxury ski villa, the prestigious Red Mountain Estate." The address alone sent a massive shockwave through the room. Aspen was the ultimate status symbol for my parents. It was the exclusive winter playground of the ultra-wealthy, a place they had constantly lied to their country club friends about visiting. They had spent decades pretending they could afford to ski there while secretly drowning in massive credit card debt. "And the purchase price?" I prompted, stepping closer to the table, smoothing my dress. "Read the purchase price, Dad, so everyone can hear it clearly." Richard looked up at me, his eyes wide with a mixture of sheer terror and absolute disbelief. $5.5 million, he gasped out the words, barely escaping his tight throat. "And look at the payment terms," I added, offering a bright, chilling smile to my brother-in-law. Terrence, being a self-proclaimed real estate mogul, could not resist. He leaned over my father's shoulder, his eyes bulging out of his head as he read the legal paperwork. "Paid in full," Terrence read aloud, his voice cracking completely, losing all of its previous swagger. "100% cash transaction. No mortgage, no financing. Paid in cash." The fake Rolex suddenly looked incredibly cheap sitting on the table. Madison dropped her orange designer bag onto the floor, entirely forgetting about it, as she stared at me with her mouth hanging open. Brenda stumbled backwards, sinking heavily into the velvet armchair she had just been dramatically crying in. $5.5 million in cash, my mother repeated, staring at me as if I were a complete stranger who had just broken into her home. The cruel laughter and nasty mockery that had filled the room just 10 minutes ago were completely dead and buried. Instead, A suffocating wave of shock paralyzed the entire family. My Aunt Patricia and Uncle George sat frozen on the dining chairs, unable to look away from the documents. But my father could not accept it. His fragile ego, built entirely on a foundation of lies and financial illusions, could not process the reality of the documents trembling in his hands. "Where did you get this kind of money?" Richard suddenly roared, crushing the expensive paper in his fist. He took a menacing step toward me, his face contorting with wild panic and explosive rage. "You work a meaningless, low-level job. You have absolutely nothing. Are you embezzling funds from your company? Are you laundering money for criminals? You are doing something highly illegal. There is absolutely no physical way a pathetic office worker buys a $5 million Aspen estate in pure cash. Tell me what illegal scam you are running right now before I call the police and turn you in myself." I looked at my father as his face contorted with panic and rage. He was practically vibrating with the desperate need to prove I was a criminal. In his narrow mind, that was the only logical explanation. There was simply no reality where the daughter he deemed a worthless failure could legally obtain $5 million in pure cash. I took a deep, slow breath and let the complete silence of the room stretch out for another few agonizing seconds. "I am not laundering money, Dad," I said, my voice echoing clearly against the high ceilings of the living room. "I am not running a scam, and I am certainly not embezzling from a company. I own the company. Or rather, I did own it until last month." I stood a little taller, locking eyes with every single person in that room, making sure they heard every single word. "I am the sole founder and chief executive officer of a financial technology firm. I built it from the ground up while you were all busy ignoring my existence. 4 weeks ago, a major tech conglomerate out of Silicon Valley acquired my entire platform." I paused, letting the weight of my words settle over them. "They bought it for a little over $400 million. I secured a massive cash payout and retained a controlling equity stake in the new merged entity. So yes, I bought a luxury ski estate in Aspen with cash. I bought it because I wanted a nice place to spend my winters, and because $5 million is basically pocket change to me now." The air in the room was instantly sucked out. You could hear a pin drop. Uncle George let out a low whistle of pure shock. Aunt Patricia covered her mouth with both hands, her eyes darting between me and the property deed still crushed in my father's fist. Richard looked as though someone had physically punched him in the stomach. He stumbled back a step, bumping into the heavy wooden bar cart. The idea that I possessed more wealth in my personal checking account than he had generated in his entire lifetime of running a failing restaurant chain completely broke his brain. But it was my mother Brenda who provided the most spectacular performance of the evening. It took her exactly 4 seconds to process the astronomical number I had just dropped into the conversation. In those 4 seconds, I watched her entire demeanor undergo a terrifying psychotic shift. The bitter, scowling woman who had just screamed that I was a psychotic liar completely vanished. In her place, a beaming, overly affectionate, and deeply manipulative mother suddenly appeared. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic gasp of joy. She clasped her hands together over her chest and took several hurried steps toward me, a sickeningly sweet smile plastered across her face. "Oh, my beautiful, brilliant girl!" Brenda cried out, her voice dripping with artificial warmth and desperate greed. "I knew it. I always knew you had this incredible potential inside you." She reached out, trying to pull me into a tight embrace, but I immediately took a sharp step backward, holding up a single hand to stop her. Brenda did not even flinch at my rejection. She simply smoothed her designer dress and continued her masterclass in gaslighting. "This is exactly why I pushed you so hard all these years, Gemma," she proclaimed, looking around the dining room to make sure the extended family was listening to her revisionist history. "I had to be tough on you. I had to play the bad guy to motivate you. If I had not given you that tough love, you never would have worked hard enough to build a company worth hundreds of millions of dollars. You owe your incredible work ethic entirely to me and your father. We made you a billionaire tonight." She actually reached up and wiped a fake tear of pride from the corner of her eye. I stared at her, feeling a profound sense of disgust wash over me. The sheer audacity required to claim credit for the success of a daughter she had financially drained and emotionally abused was genuinely staggering. But Brenda was just getting started. The absolute worst of her toxic entitlement was about to rear its ugly head. She looked down at the heavy burgundy envelope resting on the glass coffee table. Her eyes gleamed with a hungry, predatory light. "You know, Gemma?" She started, her voice taking on a sweet, coaxing tone like she was speaking to a naive child. "Now that you have achieved this massive level of success, you have to remember that family is everything. We are blood. We stick together and we share our blessings. It is the Christian thing to do on Christmas Eve." She walked over to the table and tapped her manicured fingernail against the property deed. "Your sister Madison and her husband Terrence have been working so incredibly hard lately." Brenda continued, gesturing toward the golden child who was suddenly sitting up very straight on the velvet sofa. "Terrence has been under so much terrible stress with his real estate empire. They have been utterly exhausted. They truly deserve a high-class vacation to unwind and celebrate their love." Brenda looked back at me with a wide, expectant smile, as if what she was about to say was the most logical idea in the world. "Since you clearly have more money than you could ever spend, and since you did not get them a wedding gift 5 years ago because of your financial struggles, I think it is only fair that you give them this Aspen villa. It would be the perfect late Christmas and wedding present. You can just sign the deed over to Madison and Terrence tonight. You can easily buy yourself another one tomorrow. It is the least you can do to thank us for raising you and pushing you toward greatness." The sheer insanity of her demand echoed in the silent room. Madison suddenly chimed in, her previous mockery completely forgotten. "Oh, Gemma, that would be so incredibly generous of you," Madison cooed, batting her eyelashes and acting like we were the best of friends. "Terrence and I have always wanted a ski chalet in Colorado. We would definitely let you come visit us for a weekend during the off-season." Terrence, sensing an opportunity to tap into my newly revealed fortune, quickly abandoned his hostile posture. He stood up, brushing off his suit jacket, and walked toward me with an overly familiar grin. "Hey, we got off on the wrong foot tonight," Gemma Terrence said, his voice slick and incredibly fake. "You know how family gatherings get. But seriously, as two highly successful entrepreneurs, we should grab lunch next week. I have some massive commercial developments in the pipeline. With your capital and my industry expertise, we could double your net worth in a year. We are family now. We should keep the wealth circulating in-house." I stood in the center of the living room, surrounded by the suffocating greed of my parents, my sister and her husband. They had spent the entire evening treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes. But the second they smelled money, they immediately tried to manipulate me, steal my assets, and demand multi-million-dollar gifts as if they were entirely entitled to the fortune I bled to build. I looked at Brenda, expectant smile, at Madison, greedy eyes, and at Terrence, arrogant face. A cold, calculating calm washed over my entire body. They thought they could just flip a switch and take what was mine. They had absolutely no idea that I had spent the last 6 months digging into every single one of their filthy financial secrets, and I was about to tear their entire world to shreds. I looked at my mother Brenda and my brother-in-law Terrence. Their eager, greedy faces were practically twitching with anticipation. I let a slow, mocking smirk form on my lips. I looked right into Terrence's eyes and let out a single sharp laugh. "Absolutely not." The words dropped into the room like heavy blocks of ice. "I am not giving my $5 million ski estate to people who just spent the last 2 hours treating me like garbage. You are not getting a single dime of my money, and you are certainly not getting a free luxury vacation home. You can keep your fake Rolex, Terrence, and Madison can keep her ugly orange bag. My assets belong to me." Terrence's face contorted. The slick, friendly mask he had put on just moments ago instantly evaporated. His fragile masculine ego, bruised by a woman shutting him down in front of the entire family, could not handle the rejection. He slammed his heavy fist down on the glass coffee table so hard that the crystal glasses rattled dangerously against the wood. "You listen to me, you arrogant little fluke!" Terrence bellowed, his voice booming with artificial authority. He took 2 aggressive steps toward me, pointing his index finger directly at my face. You think because you got lucky with some random tech app that you are suddenly a business genius. You think you can stand here and disrespect real entrepreneurs. You got bought out by some Silicon Valley nerds who hand out cash like candy. That is not real business. That is a lottery ticket. He paced back and forth in front of the fireplace, puffing his chest out. I build tangible assets. I construct real estate empires from the dirt up. I manage massive construction sites, deal with strict city zoning laws, and handle multi-million-dollar commercial properties. I know what it means to grind and hustle while you sit behind a computer screen typing code all day. You are a one-hit wonder, Gemma. You have zero idea how the actual economy works. I have an entire portfolio of high-yield properties that generate passive income while I sleep. You should be begging me for investment advice instead of acting like a spoiled brat who just won the jackpot. I did not flinch. I did not raise my voice or argue with his pathetic display of dominance. While Terrence stood there panting and sweating from his own self-righteous speech, I simply unzipped the side compartment of my handbag. I reached inside and pulled out my sleek silver tablet. I tapped the screen, typing in my passcode with fluid, measured movements. The ambient light from the screen illuminated my face as I opened a highly secured, encrypted file folder. I had anticipated this exact reaction. I knew Terrence was a fraud the moment he married into my family. He was nothing but a cheap hustler wearing expensive suits, trying to fake it until he made it. I scrolled down the screen, bypassing the initial summary reports and getting straight to the raw, undeniable data. Let us talk about that highly successful real estate empire of yours, Terrence. I said, my voice dangerously quiet but echoing perfectly in the tense room. Let us examine those tangible assets and multi-million-dollar commercial properties you just bragged about. I looked up from the screen, meeting his furious gaze. I have spent the last 6 weeks conducting a deep forensic audit of your entire corporate structure. I hired the best private investigators and financial analysts in California to look into your holding companies. Terrence crossed his arms, trying to maintain his tough exterior, but I saw a faint flicker of panic flash across his eyes. What are you talking about? He scoffed, stepping back slightly. You do not know anything about my business. Oh, but I do, I replied, tapping the screen. I know absolutely everything. Let us start with your flagship project, the luxury condominium complex in downtown Boston. You have been telling my parents for a year that it is fully funded and ready for construction. But according to the actual financial filings, your primary lender pulled their capital backing 4 months ago. You have a negative cash flow of $80,000 a month on that single property, just holding the empty dirt lot and paying municipal fines. Terrence's jaw tightened. He opened his mouth to interrupt, but I raised my hand and raised my voice, slicing right through his attempted defense. I am not finished, Terrence. Your commercial strip mall in New Jersey has a 30% vacancy rate, and you have defaulted on the last 3 maintenance loan payments. The bank has already issued a formal notice of default, and your supposed high-yield apartment complex in Philadelphia. That property is currently tangled in a massive class action lawsuit because you failed to fix severe structural code violations, and the city inspectors officially condemned the entire second floor. I swiped to the next page of the dossier, reading the numbers with surgical precision. You do not have a real estate empire, Terrence. You have a collapsing house of cards built entirely on high-interest subprime loans and predatory lending schemes. Your debt-to-income ratio is currently hovering around 400%. You owe millions to aggressive private lenders because no legitimate corporate bank will approve your applications anymore. You are bleeding cash every single day to cover the exorbitant interest payments on empty lots and condemned buildings. You are not a visionary, you are completely broke. The silence in the living room was absolute. My Aunt Patricia had her hand pressed flat against her chest, taking shallow breaths. Uncle George was staring at Terrence with wide, terrified eyes. My father Richard stood completely frozen by the bar cart, his face draining of all color as the sheer magnitude of the financial ruin washed over him. Madison, my supposedly perfect sister, looked as if the floor had just dropped out from beneath her designer shoes. She turned her head slowly, staring at her husband, waiting for him to laugh and tell everyone I was lying. But Terence did not laugh. He stood frozen in the middle of the expensive Persian rug, breathing heavily, his hands balled into tight fists at his sides. The swagger, the arrogance, the loud booming confidence, it was all completely gone. He looked exactly like what he was, a desperate cornered fraud whose lies had just been violently ripped open and exposed to the harsh light of reality. I swiped my finger across the glowing screen of my tablet, bringing up a digitized copy of a heavily stamped government document. I did not break eye contact with my brother-in-law as I held the device up for him to see. The bold red letters across the top of the file were impossible to misinterpret. "This is an official cease and desist order from the City Zoning Commission," I announced, making sure my voice reached every corner of the frozen living room. "Your highly publicized luxury condominium project was not just delayed, Terence. It was completely shut down by the government exactly 6 months ago. You have not poured a single ounce of concrete or driven a single nail since June. You have been lying to my sister and my parents every single day, sitting at this very dining table, bragging about a construction site that is currently locked behind a chain-link fence with a massive municipal padlock on the front gate." Terence swallowed hard, his Adam apple bobbing visibly against his tight collar. He opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The absolute silence of the room was deafening. I tapped the screen again, pulling up the next file in my heavily encrypted folder. "And here is the real reason the city shut you down," I continued mercilessly. "You ran out of capital. But instead of admitting defeat and filing for standard bankruptcy protection, you took a desperate and highly illegal gamble. You took out a massive predatory subprime loan from a shadow lending firm. You borrowed $3 million at a catastrophic interest rate using fraudulent collateral. And now that firm is filing a massive lawsuit to seize every single asset attached to your name. You are not a real estate mogul, Terence. You are a drowning man holding a $3 million anchor, and the water is officially over your head. You are going to face a judge before the end of the fiscal quarter." Madison let out a sharp, breathless gasp. She stumbled forward, her knees giving out slightly before she caught herself on the edge of the velvet sofa. She stared at the man she had married, the man my mother had worshipped as the perfect wealthy provider. "Terence," she shrieked, her voice cracking with raw, unfiltered panic. "Tell me she is lying. Tell me this is just another one of her jealous, psychotic delusions. You promised me we were secure. You promised me the business was thriving." Terence took a panicked step toward his wife, holding his hands up in a pathetic attempt to pacify her. "Baby, you have to listen to me," he stammered, his voice shaking so badly he could barely form the words. "It is just a temporary cash flow problem. The commercial market is tough right now. The interest rates spiked unexpectedly, and the city inspectors are just trying to squeeze me for bribes. I am just restructuring the debt. We are totally fine. I swear to you, we are entirely fine." Madison grabbed the orange designer bag Brenda had gifted her just 20 minutes ago and hurled it directly at Terrence's chest. It hit him with a heavy thud and dropped to the Persian rug. "You lied to me!" Madison screamed, her face contorting into an ugly mask of pure terror. "You told me we were closing on the summer house in the Hamptons next month. You told me the company was generating record profits. We just booked a first-class trip to Dubai on the premium credit card. How are we going to pay for that if you owe $3 million to loan sharks? You are completely broke. You dragged me into massive unpayable debt and humiliated me in front of the entire family. My friends at the country club are going to find out, and I will be a laughingstock." Terence lunged forward and grabbed Madison by the arms, trying to shake her into silence. "Keep your voice down," he hissed, glancing nervously at the extended family members who were watching the spectacle with wide, horrified eyes. "I am handling the lawyers. I just need a little more time to liquidate some assets. We are not going bankrupt, Madison. I have a solid plan to fix this." But Madison ripped her arms away from his grip, stumbling backward and letting out a guttural sob. Her entire identity was built on wealth and status. The realization that her lavish lifestyle was entirely funded by fraudulent loans and empty promises completely shattered her fragile reality. She turned to our parents, tears streaming down her carefully contoured face, ruining her expensive makeup. "Mom," Dad Madison wailed, pointing a shaking finger at her husband. "Do something. He lied to us. He is going to drag us all down with him. You have to fix this immediately. Throw him out of this house." I turned my attention away from the sobbing golden child and the humiliated real estate fraud. I fully expected my father to step in and unleash his booming authoritative rage. I expected Richard to grab Terence by the collar and physically throw him out into the freezing snow for deceiving his absolute favorite daughter. I expected my mother Brenda to start screaming about betrayal and demanding severe legal retribution against the man who had ruined her perfect family image. But they did nothing. Absolutely nothing. I narrowed my eyes, watching Richard and Brenda very closely. Something was horribly, terribly wrong. Instead of rushing to comfort their precious Madison, or confronting the liar standing in their living room, my parents were having a completely different reaction. Richard had backed away from the bar cart, his hands gripping the edge of the heavy wooden dining table so hard his knuckles were stark white. His face had gone beyond pale. It was practically translucent, resembling a man who was moments away from a massive cardiac arrest. Heavy beads of cold sweat were forming on his forehead and tracking down the sides of his face, soaking into his expensive collar. He was staring at the floor, unable to meet my eyes, unable to look at his weeping daughter Madison, and completely ignoring the existence of Terence. His chest heaved with rapid, terrified breaths. Brenda looked even worse. The woman who usually dominated every single room with her loud, aggressive confidence was currently shrinking into the shadows. She had retreated step by slow step until her back hit the wall near the hallway corridor. She was hyperventilating, taking short, shallow gasps of air. Her hands were shaking violently as she clutched the fabric of her holiday dress. She looked like a cornered animal, realizing the trap had just snapped shut around her neck. They were not angry at Terence. They were not furious that he had lied to Madison. They were utterly and completely terrified. And looking at their pale, sweating faces, the final piece of the devastating puzzle clicked perfectly into place in my mind. Madison thought the worst part of tonight was finding out her husband was a broke fraud. She had absolutely no idea that the $3 million debt Terence was hiding was only half the story. Because a subprime lender does not hand over $3 million to a failing developer without substantial bulletproof collateral, and Terence certainly did not have any collateral of his own. I smiled a slow, dangerous smile as the chaos of Madison's screaming faded into the background. The chaotic sobbing of my sister Madison and the pathetic excuses tumbling from Terence's mouth were suddenly cut short by a violent crash. My father, Richard, had finally snapped out of his terrified paralysis. He slammed his fist against the heavy oak bar cart with such brutal force that a crystal decanter toppled over, spilling amber liquid across the polished wood floor. He could not handle the absolute destruction of his carefully curated reality. For decades, he had ruled this family with an iron fist, demanding absolute obedience and commanding respect through financial intimidation. Now, with his precious golden child weeping on the rug and his hand-picked son-in-law exposed as a massive fraud, Richard felt his supreme patriarchal authority slipping right through his fingers. And like any desperate tyrant losing his grip on power, he reverted to the only weapon he had left, which was pure, blind aggression. Enough, Richard roared, his voice booming with a raw, furious energy that made the extended family members flinch in their seats. The veins in his neck bulged against his expensive silk collar, and his face flushed a dangerous shade of crimson. He stomped across the Persian rug, charging directly toward me like an enraged bull. He did not look like a sophisticated restaurant owner anymore. He looked like a cornered, desperate man willing to do absolutely anything to force the truth back into the dark. He stopped barely inches from my face, towering over me and raising his right hand high into the air. His chest heaved with heavy, erratic breaths. "You shut your filthy mouth right now." He spat a fine mist of saliva flying from his lips. "You will not stand in my home and utter one more single word of slander against this family. I do not care what imaginary documents you think you have on that tablet. I will slap the absolute insolence right out of you, Gemma. I will drag you by your hair and throw you out into the freezing snow myself. You are a toxic, destructive liar, and you are done poisoning this holiday." A chorus of gasps echoed from the dining room. Aunt Patricia covered her face with her hands, too terrified to intervene. Uncle George stood up quickly, but hesitated, unsure if he should physically step between a father and his daughter. Brenda remained plastered against the hallway wall, watching with wide, frantic eyes, hoping her husband's violent outburst would somehow miraculously silence me and bury the horrific secret they were both hiding. But I did not cower. I did not raise my arms to block his hand. I did not take a single step backward. 10 years ago, a threat like that would have sent me running for the front door, tears streaming down my face, apologizing profusely for stepping out of line. Tonight, I simply tilted my head up and looked him dead in the eyes. I let a slow, razor-sharp smile spread across my face. It was a smile completely devoid of warmth or fear. It was the smile of a predator who had just successfully lured its prey exactly where it wanted them to be. "If you even think about laying a single finger on me, Dad," I said, my voice dangerously quiet, but laced with an icy, lethal edge, "I will personally ensure you spend the rest of your miserable life rotting in a federal prison cell. And trust me, physical assault will be the absolute least of the criminal charges brought against you tonight." Richard hesitated, his raised hand trembling slightly in the air. The absolute icy conviction in my voice made him freeze. He searched my eyes looking for a trace of bluff or hesitation, but he found absolutely nothing except concrete certainty. His hand slowly dropped back to his side, though his fists remained tightly clenched. He was trying to figure out how much I actually knew. He was trying to calculate if my threat was empty, or if I had truly unearthed the devastating secret he and Brenda were desperate to conceal. "You are bluffing," Richard sneered, though his voice lacked its previous booming confidence. "You are just trying to cause a scene because you have always been a bitter, jealous disappointment. Now get out of my house before I call the police and have you arrested for trespassing." I did not argue with his pathetic attempt at regaining control. I simply maintained my cold smile and raised my right hand. Without breaking eye contact with my father, I snapped my fingers. The sharp, crisp sound echoed loudly in the tense, suffocating silence of the living room. It was a predetermined signal. Within exactly 2 seconds, the heavy mahogany front door swung open, bringing a sharp gust of freezing winter air into the stifling house. Heavy, confident footsteps echoed against the marble entryway. Everyone in the living room turned their heads in unison, watching the tall, imposing figure step out of the shadows of the foyer and into the warm light of the chandelier. It was David. He looked absolutely immaculate, in a tailored charcoal gray suit, his posture radiating pure corporate power and legal authority. David was not just the man I loved. He was my fiancé and the chief legal officer of my financial technology firm. He was a brilliant, ruthless attorney who had spent the last decade dismantling fraudulent corporations and tearing apart predatory financial schemes in federal courtrooms. He knew the law inside and out, and he knew exactly how to wield it like a deadly weapon. David did not say a word as he walked purposefully into the center of the living room, standing firmly right by my side. He shot a brief warning glare at Richard, silently daring my father to try and raise his hand against me again. In his right hand, David carried a heavy combination, locked titanium briefcase. It was not a gift box. It was not a holiday present. It was a portable vault containing the absolute destruction of my parents' entire lives. David set the heavy briefcase down on the glass coffee table, pushing Terrence's fake Rolex box out of the way. He spun the combination locks with a series of sharp metallic clicks. The sound was deafening in the dead silent room. My father took a slow, unsteady step backward, his eyes glued to the metal briefcase. Brenda let out a pathetic, muffled whimper from her corner, her hands flying up to cover her mouth. They both knew exactly what kind of paperwork a corporate lawyer brings to a confrontation like this. They knew their time was officially up. David popped the latches and flipped the briefcase open. He reached inside and pulled out a massive stack of thick watermarked bank documents bearing the official logos of one of the largest financial institutions in the country. He handed the heavy stack of papers directly to me. I took them, feeling the satisfying weight of absolute, undeniable truth in my hands. I turned my attention back to my sweating, terrified parents, ready to deliver the killing blow. David moved with the calculated precision of a man accustomed to destroying corporate criminals. He reached into the open titanium briefcase and pulled out several thick manila folders. He did not hand them out politely. He tossed the first folder directly onto the glass coffee table in front of my father, landing it with a sharp, heavy slap. He slid the second folder toward my Aunt Patricia and Uncle George, ensuring the extended family had a front-row seat to the incoming slaughter. The final folder he carried over to the hallway wall, where my mother Brenda was desperately trying to blend into the expensive wallpaper. David pressed the folder right against her chest, forcing her trembling hands to take it, before stepping back to stand firmly by my side. I stood beside the fireplace, the flames casting long, dancing shadows across the room. I looked at the stunned faces of my relatives. Madison was still sobbing on the velvet sofa, her mascara completely ruined, but I was entirely done dealing with her pathetic, fraudulent husband. I turned my attention fully to the two people who actually orchestrated the most sickening betrayal of all. "Look at them," I instructed, my voice cutting through the thick tension. "Look at Richard and Brenda. Terrence just admitted to bringing $3 million of toxic subprime debt into this family. Madison is having a complete nervous breakdown. But my parents are not angry at him. They are not screaming at Terrence for deceiving their precious golden child. They are sweating. They are hyperventilating. They look like they are about to face a firing squad." My father stared down at the manila folder on the table, refusing to open it. His breathing was ragged. Brenda held her folder as if it were coated in acid, her knuckles turning stark white. "Do you want to know why they are so terrified?" I asked, pacing slowly across the Persian rug. "Do you want to know why Terrence's failing real estate empire suddenly made my father look like a corpse? It all goes back to Grandpa Harrison." A collective murmur swept through the dining room. Uncle George slowly opened his folder, his eyes scanning the top document. Aunt Patricia leaned over his shoulder, reading the bold financial figures. "When I was just a little girl, Grandpa Harrison was the only person in this house who actually saw me." I continued, keeping my tone analytical and cold. "He saw through my father's ridiculous obsession with pretending to be wealthy. He saw through my mother's shallow, toxic vanity. And more importantly, he saw how they treated me. He knew they would pour every single resource they had into spoiling Madison while leaving me completely out in the cold. So before he passed away, he did something highly strategic to protect my future. He established an independent, irrevocable trust fund entirely in my name. He structured it with strict legal parameters. The stipulations were very clear. The capital was locked, and I was not legally permitted to access a single penny of that trust fund until I celebrated my 30th birthday. He wanted me to grow up, learn the value of hard work, and then receive a massive financial safety net when I was mature enough to handle it. He appointed my parents as the temporary legal custodians of the account strictly to oversee its maintenance. I stopped pacing and stood directly in front of my father. "For over a decade, you lied to my face," I stated, my voice dropping to a lethal whisper. "When I turned 18 and needed money for college, you told me the economy had crashed. You told me the trust fund took a massive hit in the stock market and that the corporate management fees had slowly bled the account dry. When I was 25 and drowning in student debt, working 3 jobs just to keep the lights on in my miserable studio apartment, I came to you for help. I asked if there was anything left in Grandpa Harrison's fund. Brenda let out a small, choked sob from the hallway, but I did not even glance in her direction. You looked me dead in the eyes, Dad, I said, recounting the memory with absolute crystal clarity. You told me there was nothing left. You called me a financial burden. You said the account was completely empty and that I needed to stop looking for handouts and take out my own loans. You watched me take on predatory interest rates to fund your cosmetic surgeries and Madison's luxury wedding while constantly reminding me that I was a broke, pathetic failure. I gestured toward the folders David had distributed. Open the files, I commanded, addressing the extended family. Uncle George, you are reading the official historical ledger for the trust fund. Read the balance on the day I turned 25. The day my parents told me the account was completely drained. Uncle George adjusted his glasses, his hands shaking slightly as he flipped to the highlighted page. His face contorted in pure shock. This says the account held over $4 million. He read aloud, his voice echoing loudly in the silent room. It was generating massive compound interest. The fund was entirely healthy, Gemma. It was never drained. Exactly, I said, offering a sharp, bitter smile. The money was always there. It was sitting in a high-yield account generating wealth while I was starving and ruining my credit score to survive. My parents intentionally kept me entirely in the dark. They gaslighted me into believing I had nothing so I would never ask questions or demand access to the capital. But that is not the real tragedy of tonight. I continued, turning my attention back to the sweating, shaking figure of my brother-in-law, Terrence. Terrence, you told Madison that you secured a $3 million subprime loan from a shadow lending firm to save your failing condominium project. But shadow lenders are not charities. They are ruthless predators. They do not hand over $3 million in liquid cash to a desperate fraud with a terrible credit score and condemned buildings. They require absolute bulletproof liquid collateral. I took a slow, deliberate step toward my father, watching the absolute terror completely consume him. A shadow lender requires a massive collateral guarantee. I explained, my voice ringing with lethal authority. They need a pristine multi-million-dollar bank account to secure a loan of that magnitude, an account exactly like a massive untouched trust fund. Madison gasped, her hands flying to her mouth as the horrifying realization finally hit her. Uncle George dropped the folder onto the table, staring at his brother-in-law and my parents with absolute disgust. The entire living room braced for the incoming shockwave as the sickening truth hung heavily in the air, tying Terrence's massive fraudulent debt directly to the fortune my grandfather had left specifically for me. I turned my gaze from the horrified faces of my extended family back to my father. His breathing was so shallow I thought he might actually pass out right there on his expensive Persian rug. He knew the exact document David had placed at the very bottom of those manila folders. Go ahead and flip to the last page, Uncle George, I instructed, my voice sharp and unwavering. Read the guarantor signature on the $3 million subprime loan that Terrence secured 6 months ago. Uncle George's hands trembled violently as he turned the heavy pages. He adjusted his glasses, squinting at the dense legal text. The room was so quiet you could hear the frantic pounding of my mother's heartbeat from across the hallway. It says, Gemma Harrison. Uncle George read, his voice dropping to a horrified whisper. It lists your name as the primary financial guarantor. It pledges the entire balance of your trust fund as liquid collateral against the default of the commercial real estate loan. Madison let out a sharp gasp. She whipped her head around to stare at her husband and then at our parents. What did you do? Madison shrieked, her voice cracking with pure panic. You used her money. You used the trust fund to back the condo project. I did not use my money, Madison. I corrected her, stepping directly into the center of the room. I was 29 years old when this loan was executed. According to the ironclad legal stipulations established by our grandfather, I had absolutely no legal authority to access, authorize, or pledge a single dime of that trust fund until my 30th birthday. I could not have signed that document, even if I wanted to. I walked slowly toward the bar cart, where my father stood frozen in sheer terror. I looked him dead in the eyes, watching his pathetic facade crumble into absolute ruin. I did not sign that commercial loan guarantee, I stated, delivering the words with brutal precision. You did. You and Brenda. You realized Terrence was drowning in massive debt and about to lose his flagship project. You knew that if his real estate empire collapsed, the lavish lifestyle you enjoyed by association would completely shatter. You could not let your precious golden child suffer the public humiliation of bankruptcy. You could not lose your favorite talking point at your elitist country club dinners. So you made a choice. A highly calculated and incredibly illegal choice. You looked at the $4 million sitting safely in my trust fund, and you decided it belonged to you. But you could not bypass the bank security measures as mere temporary custodians. You needed the primary beneficiary to authorize the massive collateral transfer. Since you spent the last decade telling me I was a worthless failure who deserved nothing, you certainly could not ask me for permission. Instead, you hired a shady corporate notary. You printed out the federal banking forms, and you completely forged my signature. Brenda let out a loud, dramatic wail from the hallway, sliding down the expensive wallpaper until she hit the hardwood floor. We were going to put it back, she sobbed uncontrollably, burying her face in her hands. Terrence promised us a 20% return on the investment. He swore the condo project was going to generate tens of millions in pure profit. We just needed to secure the bridge loan to get through the winter. We were going to replace your trust fund before you ever turned 30 and keep the massive profits to save our failing restaurant chain. We did it for the family, Gemma. We did it to save everyone. You did it because you are greedy, selfish criminals. I shot back, refusing to offer her a single ounce of sympathy. You risked my entire financial future to fund your fake elite status. You literally stole the only thing my grandfather ever gave me and handed it over to a fraudulent hustler. You essentially handed a $3 million loaded gun to a man who did not even have the basic municipal permits to pour concrete on his own construction site. And the absolute most sickening part of your betrayal is the sheer, unforgivable hypocrisy of it all. You drained my financial security to save Terrence and Madison. You committed a federal felony to ensure they could keep flying first class and buying designer handbags. But when I came to you crying, begging for a fraction of that amount to pay off my student debt and survive, you told me to stop looking for handouts. You literally watched me starve and ruin my health while you illegally gambled away my inheritance. David stepped forward, opening a secondary compartment in his titanium briefcase. He pulled out a sleek black binder and tossed it onto the coffee table, right next to the fraudulent deed. That is a comprehensive forensic handwriting analysis, David announced, his deep voice resonating with absolute legal authority. I retained 3 independent federally certified handwriting experts to examine the signature on the loan guarantee. Their conclusion was unanimous. The signature is a complete and total forgery. Furthermore, we subpoenaed the digital access logs from the electronic notary service. The digital signature was executed directly from the Internet Protocol address, registered to this very house, on a Tuesday afternoon when Gemma was provably sitting in her corporate office 3 states away. David crossed his arms, staring down at my father with pure professional disgust. We possessed the exact bank transfer records, the fraudulent notarization logs, and the internal email communications between Terrence and Richard, discussing the illegal collateral pledge. You did not just make a poor financial decision, Richard. You committed massive federal wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. Aunt Patricia stood up from her chair, pushing the manila folder away, as if it were infected with a deadly virus. She looked at her brother Richard with an expression of pure, unadulterated revulsion. You stole from your own daughter, Patricia whispered, her voice shaking with intense anger. You forged her signature to give her inheritance to a con artist. You are a monster, Richard. Both of you are absolute monsters. Uncle George shook his head, refusing to even look at Brenda sobbing on the floor. I cannot believe I am related to you, he muttered, stepping away from the table. The reality of their monstrous crime hung heavily over the living room. They had not just favored one child over the other, they had actively and maliciously stripped me of my legal assets. They had violated federal law and shattered every conceivable boundary of parental trust, all to supply their golden child and her fraudulent husband with unearned wealth. They had sacrificed my livelihood on the altar of their own bottomless greed. And now the bill for their devastating betrayal had finally come due. The illusion of family loyalty shattered instantly. The moment the sheer gravity of federal wire fraud settled into their brains, the united front they had maintained against me completely disintegrated. There was no more teaming up to call me a failure. There was no more standing shoulder to shoulder to protect their perfect elite image. It became a brutal bloodbath of self-preservation, and they turned on each other like a pack of starving wolves. Terrence was the first to snap. He stared at the forensic handwriting analysis on the coffee table and then slowly turned his fierce gaze toward my father. The veins in his neck were pulsing visibly against his dark skin. "You forged her signature," Terrence bellowed, his voice cracking with a mixture of raw panic and explosive fury. He took a menacing step toward Richard, shoving a heavy leather armchair out of his way. "You told me the trust fund was under your direct legal control. You looked me in the eye and swore you had the authorization to pledge those assets to the shadow lenders to secure my commercial bridge loan." Richard backed away, holding his hands up defensively. "Lower your voice, Terrence," Richard hissed, casting nervous glances toward the extended family members who were watching the implosion with wide, terrified eyes. "We did what we had to do to save your failing condominium project. You came to us begging for a bailout. You said you were going to lose everything if we did not provide immediate liquid collateral. I did not ask you to commit a federal felony," Terrence screamed, throwing his arms in the air in sheer disbelief. "I asked for a private loan from my wealthy in-laws. I thought you were actually rich. I thought you had the legitimate capital to back my construction firm. Instead, you secretly dragged me into a massive criminal conspiracy. Do you have any idea what the federal government does to real estate developers who use stolen trust funds as collateral? They do not just seize the properties, they send you to federal prison. You made me an unwitting accomplice to aggravated identity theft and wire fraud. You are not an unwitting anything." Richard roared back, his own panic boiling over into pure rage. "You knew exactly how desperate the financial situation was. You took the $3 million and you spent half of it trying to cover up your massive code violations in Philadelphia. Do not stand there and play the innocent victim right now. You gladly took the dirty money to fund your fake empire because you are nothing but a broke hustler." While the two men screamed at each other in the center of the living room, Madison finally erupted. She did not fall to her knees to apologize to me. She did not express a single ounce of remorse that her parents had stolen her older sister's entire financial future to fund her lifestyle. Instead, Madison turned her absolute fury onto our mother. "How could you do this to me?" Madison shrieked. Her face twisted in a mask of pure selfish agony. She stomped her designer heel into the Persian rug, glaring down at Brenda, who was still weeping pathetically on the floor. "You humiliated me, Mom. You told me Terrence and I were the ultimate power couple. You told me you were providing a small family loan to help us expand our portfolio. Now Uncle George and Aunt Patricia know we are completely broke. My friends at the country club are going to find out my husband is a fraud and my parents are literal criminals." Brenda looked up at her golden child, her tear-streaked face a picture of absolute desperation. "Madison, sweetie, please," Brenda begged, reaching a shaking hand up toward her daughter. "We did it for you. We did it so you would not have to sell your beautiful house in the suburbs. We did it so you could keep your luxury cars and go on your expensive vacations. We sacrificed our own integrity to protect your perfect lifestyle." "You ruined my life," Madison screamed, kicking a discarded wrapping paper box across the room. "You dragged my name into a massive federal fraud case. If the police come to this house, it is going to be on the local news. The country club board will revoke my membership immediately. How am I supposed to show my face at the charity galas next month? You and Dad are so stupid. Why would you steal from a trust fund that leaves a massive paper trail?" Why did you not just take out a second mortgage on this house like normal people? Because this house is already mortgaged to the absolute limit, Richard yelled over the chaos, turning his fury onto his daughter. We have nothing left, Madison. We drained our restaurant revenue to pay for your $100,000 wedding. We maxed out our credit lines to buy your mother new jewelry and luxury cars so you could brag about us to your snobby friends. We had to use Gemma Trust Fund because it was the only piece of clean capital left in this entire miserable family. I stood quietly beside David, watching the spectacular destruction unfold. It was truly a masterpiece of human selfishness. Not a single one of them looked in my direction. Not a single one of them expressed a fraction of an ounce of guilt for stealing my inheritance, forging my signature, or watching me starve in a studio apartment while they gambled with my money. Their entire world was collapsing, and their only concern was saving their own skins and protecting their pathetic social status. Terrence paced frantically, running his hands over his head. I am calling my defense attorney, he muttered, pulling his phone from his tailored pocket. I am cutting a deal immediately. I will testify that you two orchestrated the entire forgery. I will hand over every single email and text message proving you initiated the collateral transfer. I am not going to a federal penitentiary for your pathetic family. You will do no such thing, Richard snarled, lunging forward and grabbing Terrence by the lapels of his expensive suit. We are in this together. If you try to throw us under the bus, I will personally hand the prosecutors the ledgers, showing how you embezzled the loan money to pay off your personal debts instead of funding the construction site. Terrence violently shoved my father backward. Do not touch me, you broke, pathetic old man. Terrence spat, smoothing his ruined jacket. You are nothing but a bankrupt restaurant manager playing pretend. I am filing for divorce from your spoiled daughter tomorrow morning. I am taking whatever assets are left in my name, and I am completely severing ties with this insane family to save myself. Madison let out a blood-curdling scream at the mention of divorce. She lunged at Terrence, pounding her fists against his chest. You cannot leave me, she sobbed hysterically, completely abandoning her previous anger for sheer desperation. You promised me a luxury lifestyle. You promised me the Hamptons. You cannot just abandon me with these criminals. I watched the vicious brawl escalate, taking a deep, satisfying breath of the tense living room air. Aunt Patricia and Uncle George had quietly backed away toward the front door, wanting absolutely nothing to do with the radioactive blast zone this family had become. My parents and my sister were tearing each other limb from limb, fighting like rats trapped in a sinking ship. The unbreakable family loyalty they had weaponized against me for 33 years was nothing but a cheap, fragile illusion. They were finally experiencing the exact same betrayal and absolute abandonment they had forced me to endure my entire life. And the absolute best part was that I had not even delivered the final crushing blow yet. The chaotic shouting match between Richard and Terrence was reaching a fever pitch, with threats of aggressive defense lawyers and immediate divorce flying across the room. But Brenda suddenly realized that arguing with the men would not save her from the incoming legal slaughter. She turned her tear-stained face toward me. The transition was incredibly disturbing to witness. 1 second she was a defeated criminal sobbing on the hardwood floor, and the next second she was slipping back into her most practiced and insidious role, the martyred loving mother. She scrambled to her feet, smoothing down the wrinkled fabric of her expensive holiday dress. She completely ignored her golden child Madison, who was still weeping hysterically into the sofa cushions. Brenda locked her desperate, panicked eyes on me and walked slowly across the Persian rug. She held her hands out in front of her, palms open like she was approaching a wild, frightened animal she needed to tame. I stood perfectly still with David at my side, watching her carefully constructed performance unfold. When she was within arm reach, she lunged forward and grabbed my left hand. Her fingers were ice cold and trembling violently. Her grip was painfully tight, digging into my skin as if I were the last remaining life raft on a rapidly sinking ship. "Oh, Gemma, my sweet, beautiful girl," Brenda cried, her voice wavering with practiced dramatic emotion. "You have to listen to me. You have to look at the bigger picture here and understand our hearts. We did not steal from you. We would never maliciously steal from our own flesh and blood. We just borrowed the funds temporarily to make a high-yield investment for the family. It was a simple bridge loan. We were going to put every single penny back into the trust fund before you ever even noticed it was missing. We just needed a little bit of leverage to help your sister and her husband get through a rough patch in the commercial market. We are a family, Gemma. Families help each other when times get tough. She squeezed my hand harder, leaning in close so I could smell the stale wine and sheer primal panic on her breath. And look at you now. Brenda continued, forcing a pathetic, trembling smile onto her face, trying to project maternal pride through her terror. Look at how incredibly successful you are today. You just told us you sold your tech company for hundreds of millions of dollars. You are a literal billionaire. You have more money than all of us combined. That $3 million from the trust fund is absolutely nothing to you now. It is just a drop in the bucket. It is meaningless pocket change. Are you really going to destroy our entire family over a few pennies? Are you genuinely going to call the federal authorities and send your own flesh and blood, your own mother and father, to a federal penitentiary over a tiny financial misunderstanding? You cannot be that cold-hearted. You have always been such a good, forgiving girl. I stared at her face. I looked at the smeared, expensive makeup, the fake tears pooling in her eyes, and the absolute shameless audacity radiating from her pores. She was actually trying to weaponize my own hard-earned success to absolve herself of a federal felony. I felt a surge of pure, unadulterated disgust rise in my chest. I did not yell. I did not scream. I simply raised my right hand and violently slapped her grip away from me. I shoved her hands back toward her chest with such forceful disgust that Brenda physically stumbled backward, losing her balance and nearly tripping over the edge of the glass coffee table. "Do not ever touch me again," I stated, my voice radiating an icy, lethal calm that instantly froze the air around us. "And do not ever dare to use the word family in my presence to manipulate me. You do not get to invoke family loyalty to excuse wire fraud and aggravated identity theft. You do not get to minimize a $3 million felony by calling it a temporary investment or a tiny misunderstanding." I took a slow, deliberate step toward her, backing her up against the edge of the velvet sofa. "You did not borrow anything, Brenda. Borrowing implies consent. Borrowing implies you actually asked the legal owner for permission. You forged my signature on federal banking documents because you knew I would never hand over my grandfather's money to fund your pathetic, desperate need to look wealthy at the country club. And do not you dare try to use my current net worth to justify your sickening crimes. The fact that I am wealthy now does not magically erase the reality of what you did. Because when you forged that signature, I was not a billionaire. When you stole that money, I was 29 years old, drowning in debt, working 16-hour days, and eating expired food just to survive. I came to you crying, begging for a tiny fraction of that money to pay my rent and keep my electricity from being shut off. You looked at your starving, desperate daughter, and you called me a pathetic failure. You told me to stop looking for handouts while you were secretly gambling away my entire financial future on a fraudulent condo project. You watched me suffer. I continued, my voice dropping lower, vibrating with 10 years of suppressed rage. You watched me wear shoes with holes in the soles. You watched me sell my only reliable car to cover my basic living expenses. You sat in your warm, expensive house, drinking premium wine and buying counterfeit designer goods for your fraudulent son-in-law, while you actively drained the only safety net my grandfather ever provided for me. You did not care if I ended up homeless on the streets. You did not care if the crushing stress completely destroyed my health. Your only concern was making sure Madison never had to fly economy and making sure your elite friends never found out you were drowning in massive debt. So do not stand there and ask me if I am cold-hearted enough to send my own parents to prison for a few pennies. Do not try to manipulate me with fake tears and empty apologies. You are not crying because you feel guilty for betraying me. You are only crying because you finally got caught. You are crying because David brought a titanium briefcase full of forensic evidence into your living room, and you suddenly realize you cannot gaslight your way out of a federal indictment. You are staring down the barrel of a 20-year prison sentence, and you are terrified because you know you absolutely deserve it. I folded my arms across my chest, presenting an impenetrable wall of absolute resolve. Your desperate little performance is completely over, Brenda. The victim card does not work on me anymore. You are looking at a woman who survived your cruelty and built an empire from the ashes, and I am entirely immune to your toxic lies. Brenda finally went entirely silent. Her tear-stained face crumpled in absolute defeat as she slid down the expensive wallpaper and sat heavily on the hardwood floor, unable to formulate another manipulative excuse. The suffocating weight of my words had completely crushed her pathetic attempts at playing the victim. I did not offer her a hand. I did not offer her a single ounce of comfort. I simply turned away from her and looked toward my fiancé. David understood exactly what I needed. He stepped forward, his polished leather shoes clicking sharply against the floorboards. He unbuttoned his tailored charcoal suit jacket with a slow, deliberate motion, projecting an aura of absolute legal authority. He did not look at Brenda or Richard like they were his future in-laws. He looked at them with the cold, calculating precision of a federal prosecutor examining cornered criminals. You both seem to be operating under a very dangerous and incredibly foolish legal misconception. David began, his deep voice carrying effortlessly through the tense living room. You are speaking as if this is some trivial domestic dispute. You keep using phrases like family investment and temporary bridge loan, as if you simply borrowed $20 from your daughter's purse without asking. You are trying to frame a massive financial crime as a private family matter that can be resolved with a forced apology and a fake smile over Christmas dinner. David walked over to the glass coffee table and tapped his finger against the stack of banking documents and the forensic handwriting analysis. Let me clarify your current reality, David stated, keeping his tone entirely clinical. When you forged Gemma's signature on those commercial banking forms, you crossed a catastrophic line. You transmitted fraudulent financial guarantees across state lines to a shadow lending firm to secure $3 million for Terrence's failing real estate project. That specific action triggers Title 18 of the United States Code Section 1343. It is legally defined as federal wire fraud. Aunt Patricia gasped quietly, clutching her husband's arm. Uncle George looked physically sick. Terrence, who had been frantically texting his own defense attorney in the corner, froze and stared at David with wide, terrified eyes. But you did not stop there. David continued, his gaze locking onto my father. By unlawfully utilizing Gemma personal identifying information, her social security number, her date of birth, and her private trust fund account numbers, to execute that fraudulent wire transmission, you also committed aggravated identity theft under federal law. Furthermore, because the financial institution holding the trust fund is insured by the Federal Deposit Insurance Corporation, your actions automatically constitute bank fraud. David paused, letting the heavy legal terminology sink into their panicked brains. These are not state-level misdemeanors that you can quietly settle out of court or sweep under the rug with a generous campaign donation to a local judge. These are severe federal felonies investigated by the Federal Bureau of Investigation and prosecuted by the United States Department of Justice. The federal sentencing guidelines are incredibly strict. Wire fraud carrying a financial loss of this magnitude carries a maximum statutory penalty of 20 years in a federal penitentiary. Bank fraud carries an additional maximum penalty of 30 years. And aggravated identity theft carries a mandatory consecutive 2-year prison sentence that cannot be reduced or served concurrently. The room was completely paralyzed. The sheer gravity of facing decades in a federal prison cell finally penetrated the thick wall of arrogance my parents had built around themselves. Madison buried her face in her hands, weeping silently on the velvet sofa, realizing her parents were facing actual prison time to fund her luxurious lifestyle. David delivered the final legal blow. The federal government does not care that you are her parents. The Department of Justice does not recognize family loans when fraudulent signatures are involved. If Gemma takes this titanium briefcase to the FBI field office tomorrow morning, both of you will be indicted, arrested, and federally prosecuted. You will lose your passports. You will be stripped of every single asset you own to pay federal restitution. And you will spend the rest of your natural lives wearing prison uniforms. Richard stood frozen by the bar cart. The color had entirely drained from his face, but as the paralyzing terror washed over him, something else began to rise from the depths of his fragile, narcissistic ego. He had spent his entire life dominating every room he entered. He had spent decades bullying his employees, controlling his wife, and belittling me to make himself feel powerful. His mind simply could not accept the reality of being utterly defeated by the daughter he considered a pathetic failure. The terror in his eyes was suddenly replaced by a wild, desperate fury. The blood rushed back into his face, turning his cheeks a mottled, angry purple. He slammed his heavy fist against the wooden bar cart, sending another crystal glass crashing to the floor where it shattered into 100 pieces. "You think you can walk into my house and threaten me with this legal garbage?" Richard roared, his voice shaking with explosive, desperate rage. He pointed a trembling finger at David and then violently redirected it toward me. "I am a respected business owner in this state. I know city council members. I play golf with state senators. You think the FBI is going to break down my door because my ungrateful, mentally unstable daughter threw a psychotic tantrum over a family financial strategy?" Richard took 2 aggressive steps toward the coffee table, glaring at the documents as if he could set them on fire with his eyes alone. "You have absolutely no idea who you are dealing with, Gemma." He spat, his upper lip curling into an ugly sneer. "I will not be intimidated by your arrogant lawyer boyfriend. I have a team of corporate defense attorneys on retainer who will chew you both up and spit you out. I will liquidate every single restaurant I own to hire the most vicious legal defense team in the country. We will drag this out in court for 10 years until you are bankrupt from the legal fees." He paced back and forth, his breathing ragged, his desperation making him completely delusional. "You want to play hardball?" Richard yelled, his voice cracking. "Let us play hardball. If you even try to take those fabricated documents to the police, I will file a massive countersuit against you tomorrow morning. I will sue you for severe defamation of character, slander, and intentional infliction of emotional distress. I will tell the media that you suffered a massive psychological breakdown and fabricated this entire conspiracy to extort your loving parents." Richard stopped pacing and stared at me with a look of pure, unadulterated hatred. "You just sold your little tech company for hundreds of millions of dollars, right? You are a highly visible public figure now. How do you think your fancy new Silicon Valley investors are going to react when your own father goes on national television and exposes you as a vindictive, mentally ill liar who is trying to send her innocent parents to prison? I will drag your new billionaire reputation through the mud. I will completely destroy your public image, and I will sue you for every single penny you just made from that tech buyout." He crossed his arms, puffing his chest out, in a pathetic final attempt to reclaim his shattered patriarchal authority. "You are not going to the FBI, Gemma. You are going to leave those documents on my table. You are going to take your arrogant boyfriend, and you are going to walk out the front door before I destroy your entire life." I stood perfectly still, letting his desperate screaming fade into the quiet crackle of the fireplace. I looked at the broken crystal glass on the floor, at my weeping sister on the sofa, and at my father panting like a cornered animal trying to bare its teeth. He honestly believed he still had leverage. He honestly believed his threats of defamation and expensive lawyers could scare me into submission. He had absolutely no idea that his entire existence was already resting firmly in the palm of my hand. I looked at David and we both shared a brief, cold smile, because my father was right about exactly one thing. I was not going to call the FBI tonight. I had a much more agonizing punishment prepared for him. I let out a laugh. It started low in my chest and bubbled up into a genuine bright sound of pure, unfiltered amusement. It was not a nervous chuckle or a defensive scoff. It was a loud, ringing laugh that bounced off the high ceilings and completely shattered the heavy, suffocating tension in the room. Richard stopped dead in his tracks. His furious, aggressive posture faltered as he stared at me in total bewilderment. He had expected me to cower. He had expected his booming voice and threats of endless litigation to force me into immediate submission. Instead, I was standing in front of his fireplace, laughing directly in his face. David stood beside me, perfectly still, watching the pathetic display of my father's fragile ego. I took a deep breath, calming my laughter, and looked at the angry purple hue of my father's face. "You want to sue me for defamation, Dad?" I asked, my tone light and conversational. "You want to call a press conference and tell the world that I am a mentally unstable liar? Please be my guest. Call the local news stations right now. My investors in Silicon Valley do not care about your petty suburban family drama. They only care about my profit margins and my technical algorithms. And as for your high-powered corporate defense attorneys, you cannot even afford to pay your catering bill for this holiday party, let alone retain a top-tier legal team for a decade-long court battle." Richard opened his mouth to shout another threat, but I raised my hand, stopping him instantly. "But you do not have to worry about any of that, Dad," I said, my voice dropping to a calm, reassuring register. I looked at Brenda, who was still sitting on the hardwood floor, trembling. I looked at Madison, who was wiping her ruined mascara with a cocktail napkin. I looked at Terrence, who was nervously clutching his cell phone. "I am not calling the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I announced clearly and slowly, ensuring every single syllable registered in their panicked brains. "There are no federal agents waiting at the end of the driveway. I have not submitted a single piece of this forensic evidence to the Department of Justice. I am not pressing criminal charges for wire fraud or aggravated identity theft against my own parents." The reaction was immediate and entirely visceral. It was as if a massive, invisible weight had been instantly lifted from the room. A collective, heavy sigh of relief rushed out of my parents' lungs. Uncle George and Aunt Patricia exchanged confused glances, unsure of what was happening. Terrence slumped his shoulders forward, letting his head drop in sheer relief, realizing he was not going to be indicted as an accomplice to a federal felony. I took another step forward, keeping my hands relaxed at my sides. Furthermore, I continued, "I am not going to file a civil lawsuit against you to recover the stolen trust fund. I am not going to drag you into a courtroom to demand my $3 million back. I consider that money entirely gone. It is a sunk cost. I am walking away from the inheritance completely." The transformation that overtook my family in that precise second was truly a masterpiece of human delusion. The paralyzing terror that had gripped them just moments before completely evaporated. It vanished into thin air, replaced instantly by their default state of blinding arrogance. Brenda let out a shaky, breathless laugh. She pushed herself up from the floor, smoothing the expensive fabric of her dress. The fake tears dried up instantly. She looked at me with a sickeningly triumphant smile, her chest puffing out with renewed confidence. "Oh, Gemma." Brenda sighed, placing a hand over her heart. "I knew you would come to your senses. I knew my sweet girl would never do something so horrific to her own family. You gave us quite a scare with all this dramatic legal talk, but blood is always thicker than water. I knew you would forgive us." Richard straightened his posture, pulling his shoulders back and adjusting his silk tie. His face regained its normal color, and that familiar, smug, condescending sneer returned to his lips. He actually chuckled, shaking his head, as if I had just thrown a childish temper tantrum that he had successfully managed. "You made the smart choice," Gemma Richard said, his voice returning to its booming, authoritative pitch. "It takes a big person to admit when they are overreacting. You have plenty of money now anyway. Taking us to court would have just been a bitter, vindictive waste of your time. We can put this ugly little misunderstanding behind us and move forward as a united family." Even Terrence regained his swagger. He slipped his phone back into his tailored pocket and offered me a cocky, knowing grin. He honestly believed he had just scored a free $3 million loan with zero consequences. He thought he had outsmarted everyone in the room. "See," Terrence said, pointing a finger at me. "This is what real business looks like. You assess the situation, you realize the legal fees are not worth the hassle, and you cut your losses. Good job, kid. You are finally learning how the real world operates. They were all practically glowing with arrogant relief. They honestly believed they had won. They thought my decision to withhold police involvement was an act of weakness. They thought my refusal to sue them was proof that I was still the fragile, desperate daughter who craved their approval and feared their anger. They mistook my tactical silence for surrender. I stood there and let them enjoy their hollow victory. I let them bask in the delusion that they had successfully manipulated their way out of a massive federal crime. I let them smile and congratulate themselves for outsmarting the system. Then I let my own smile shift. It lost all of its previous conversational warmth. The edges of my lips curled upward into a cold, calculated, and utterly sinister expression. The temperature in the room seemed to plummet instantly. My eyes locked onto Richard, and the triumphant grin on his face slowly began to falter as he noticed the predatory darkness settling over my features. "You completely misunderstand me," I whispered, my voice slicing through their arrogant chatter like a serrated blade. "I am not withholding the forensic evidence from the federal authorities because I forgive you. I am not walking away from the $3 million civil lawsuit because I value our family bonds or because I'm afraid of your lawyers. I took one final step forward, standing right in the center of the predators I was about to slaughter. I am not taking you to court," I stated with absolute chilling finality, "because the American justice system is far too slow and far too lenient for my taste. I do not need a federal judge to punish you. I do not need a civil court to order restitution. I prefer the efficiency of the free market." David snapped the titanium briefcase shut, the sharp metallic click echoing like a gunshot. He picked it up and casually stepped back, allowing me the floor. The smug relief on my parents' faces completely died, replaced by a new deep-seated confusion. They had avoided prison, but the look in my eyes told them they had just stumbled into a much deadlier trap. I watched their arrogant smiles collapse as I prepared to unleash the most ruthless financial execution they could ever imagine. David did not step back into the shadows. Instead, he reached inside the interior pocket of his tailored suit jacket and withdrew a single sleek black folder. It was entirely different from the thick manila files containing the forensic evidence of their federal crimes. This folder was embossed with a sharp minimalist silver logo. It was the corporate insignia of my private equity investment firm. He handed it to me with a respectful nod. I held the black folder up, letting the silver logo catch the warm light of the chandelier. "I want to teach you a very important lesson about the modern American financial system." I began pacing slowly across the Persian rug. "You see, Dad, you always told me I did not understand how real business worked. You mocked my career choice and told your country club friends I was a pathetic failure. Terrence, you stood in this very room tonight and bragged about building tangible assets while insulting my technology background. You both operate under the delusion that physical real estate and restaurant chains are the ultimate symbols of wealth." I opened the sleek black folder and pulled out a stack of impeccably printed legal contracts. "But the absolute truth of the American economy is much more ruthless than bricks and mortar." I continued, my voice echoing with icy authority. "The real power does not lie with the people who manage failing construction sites, or the people who run outdated suburban dining establishments. The ultimate power lies entirely with the corporate entities that hold the debt." I looked directly at my father, watching the confusion creep back into his eyes. "Let us talk about your restaurant chain, Dad. You have spent the last 5 years taking out massive commercial mortgages to keep those doors open while your actual revenue plummeted. You remortgaged your primary properties over and over again to fund your lavish lifestyle and to buy luxury cars for Madison. You thought you could just keep rolling the massive debt forward indefinitely, hiding behind your fake country club status. But commercial banks deeply despise toxic assets. When a business owner misses 3 consecutive quarterly payments, the financial institution classifies that mortgage as highly distressed debt. They want it completely off their balance sheets before the end of the fiscal year to appease their shareholders. I turned my intense gaze toward Terrence, whose arrogant posture was rapidly deteriorating into raw panic. And shadow lenders are even more aggressive, Terrence. Those predatory firms that handed you $3 million based on my forged signature are not in the business of holding on to condemned apartment complexes and padlocked dirt lots. When the City Zoning Commission shut down your flagship project, your lenders instantly realized you were a massive financial liability. They wanted to liquidate your subprime loan immediately, just to recoup a fraction of their initial capital investment before you inevitably filed for bankruptcy. I took a deliberate step toward the glass coffee table and dropped the new stack of contracts right on top of the forensic handwriting analysis. When financial institutions and shadow lenders want to dump toxic distressed debt, they sell it to private equity firms for pennies on the dollar. It is a completely standard, ruthless, and entirely legal financial mechanism in the American economy. Banks sell the paper at a huge discount, and the private equity firms assume absolute legal ownership of the outstanding loans, with all the original collection rights fully intact. Richard stared at the silver logo on the documents. His breath hitched audibly in his throat, sounding like a man suffocating. "What exactly did you do?" Richard choked out his voice, sounding thin and utterly terrified. "I did exactly what a ruthless capitalist does," I replied, flashing a cold, predatory smile. 6 weeks ago, I established a shell subsidiary under my primary investment holding company. I utilized a team of elite corporate acquisition lawyers who specialize entirely in purchasing distressed commercial debt. We approached the primary commercial bank holding the mortgages for your entire restaurant chain, Dad. We offered them a fast lump sum cash payment to buy out your toxic loans. Since you were actively defaulting and ignoring their calls, the bank was absolutely thrilled to dump your financial garbage onto our plate. We bought your entire commercial debt portfolio at a steep 60% discount. I shifted my focus back to my sweating brother-in-law. Then my lawyers approached the shadow lending firm holding your $3 million subprime loan, Terrence. We informed their executives that their collateral was currently tied up in a massive federal forgery investigation and would likely be frozen by the Department of Justice for a decade. We offered to buy your fraudulent debt paper right then and there to save them the massive legal headache of an FBI inquiry. They happily signed the transfer agreements and eagerly took our cash payout. Madison let out a sharp gasp, her hands clutching the fabric of her expensive holiday dress. Aunt Patricia and Uncle George watched the brutal financial execution unfold with wide, horrified eyes. Brenda was still sitting on the floor, her mouth hanging open in pure, unadulterated shock. They were all finally beginning to understand the catastrophic magnitude of my financial maneuver. I had not just cornered them, I had completely swallowed them whole. I stood tall in the center of the room, projecting absolute dominance over the people who had treated me like garbage for 33 years. I did not need to involve the Federal Bureau of Investigation. I did not need to sit in a civil courtroom for 5 excruciating years arguing with your cheap defense attorneys over a stolen trust fund while you continued to live in luxury. I used my liquid capital to execute a completely hostile financial takeover of your entire existence. I tapped my manicured fingernail against the top contract on the coffee table, making a sharp clicking sound. These documents are the official legal reassignment of your commercial mortgages and your subprime loans. The corporate banks and the shadow lenders no longer hold your paper. They legally transferred every single one of your massive debts directly to my investment firm. The realization hit Richard like a physical blow. He staggered backward, clutching his chest as if his heart were suddenly failing him. Terrence's eyes widened in sheer, unfiltered panic as he looked at the legal transfers bearing my corporate logo. The arrogant real estate bro and the tyrannical patriarch were completely stripped of their illusions. They realized simultaneously that they had not escaped punishment. They had walked blindly into an inescapable execution chamber. "You bought our debt," Richard whispered, his eyes wide with absolute mind-numbing horror. "I bought all of it," I confirmed, my voice ringing with lethal finality. I own the commercial mortgages on every single restaurant location you currently operate. I own the subprime loans attached to Terrence condemned apartment buildings and empty dirt lots. I own the massive second mortgage you took out on this very house to pay for Madison luxury wedding. I bypassed the entire American justice system, and I simply purchased your financial souls. I let the heavy, suffocating silence hang over the room, allowing the absolute horror of their new reality to sink deep into their bones. You see, when you deal with a traditional commercial bank, or even a predatory shadow lender, you are dealing with a faceless corporate bureaucracy. You can dodge their phone calls. You can file for extensions. You can hide behind legal loopholes and beg for restructuring plans. But you are no longer dealing with a bank. You are dealing directly with me. I am the sole exclusive and entirely legal creditor of every single asset you proudly parade around this affluent town. I walked slowly toward the head of the long dining table where my father had sat for decades dictating the rules of this family. I placed my hands flat against the polished mahogany, leaning forward to ensure he absorbed every word. You spent your entire life controlling my mother, my sister, and me through financial intimidation, Richard. You made us grovel for your approval because you held the purse strings. You demanded absolute obedience because you supposedly paid the bills. But the power dynamic in this room has permanently shifted. I hold your financial lifeblood in the palm of my hand. If I decide to call in the full balance of your defaulted commercial mortgages tomorrow morning, your restaurant chain ceases to exist. I own the dining tables. I own the commercial fryers. I own the liquor licenses. Your entire legacy is now my personal property. Richard stared at me with hollow, sunken eyes. The tyrannical patriarch who had threatened to drag me out by my hair just 30 minutes ago was completely gone. He was nothing but an empty, broken shell of a man, realizing that his own daughter had legally conquered his entire existence. He could not even muster the strength to argue because there was absolutely no argument left to make. I turned my focus back to the so-called real estate visionary. Terrence was sweating profusely, shifting his weight from foot to foot, as if preparing to bolt for the front door. But there was nowhere for him to run. "Terrence," I said, projecting my voice with crisp authority, "you stood in this living room and confidently lectured me about tangible assets. You mocked my technology background and told me I did not understand how real wealth was generated. Well, let us discuss your tangible assets. Because I purchased your subprime loans, I hold the first lien position on every single dirt lot and condemned apartment complex you currently operate. If you attempt to file for Chapter 11, bankruptcy to escape this mess, it will not save you. As your primary secured creditor, I am first in line to liquidate everything you possess. I own the very ground you stand on. You cannot build, you cannot sell, and you cannot borrow without my explicit legal authorization. You are completely financially paralyzed." Madison let out a high-pitched wail, clutching her head in her hands. The reality of her situation was finally breaking through her dense layer of entitlement. Her entire identity was tied to being the wealthy, successful golden child. She had spent years looking down her nose at me, flaunting her designer clothes and luxury vacations. Now she was forced to comprehend that the sister she had mocked and excluded was the absolute master of her financial universe. Brenda was still sitting on the floor, staring blankly at the wall. The perfectly groomed country club matriarch looked utterly destroyed. Her flawless makeup was ruined, her designer dress was wrinkled, and her grand delusions of high society dominance were completely shattered. She had sacrificed her own flesh and blood to maintain a fake image of wealth, and now that very wealth was being weaponized against her. "You begged me not to call the Federal Bureau of Investigation," I stated, walking back to stand beside David, who watched the execution with silent professional approval. "You thought the threat of federal prison was the worst possible outcome for your crimes. But sending you to a federal penitentiary would actually be an act of mercy. In prison, you would receive 3 free meals a day. You would have a warm bed. You would get to sit around with other white-collar criminals and play the victim, blaming the ruthless justice system for your downfall. You would never have to face the brutal reality of the actual economy. I shook my head, offering them a chilling, merciless smile. I am not going to give you the luxury of an easy escape. I want you to stay right here in the real world. I want you to wake up every single morning and experience the exact same crushing, paralyzing financial terror you forced me to endure for years. I want you to know what it feels like to check your bank account and realize you cannot afford basic groceries. I want you to experience the humiliation of having your credit cards declined at the grocery store. I want you to feel the sheer desperation of knowing you are one missed payment away from being thrown out onto the freezing street. You stole my trust fund to fund a fake luxurious life. I continued, my voice rising with unyielding power. You used my name to commit a federal felony just to keep up appearances at your pathetic country club. Now I am going to legally strip away every single luxury you possess. You are going to learn how to survive on minimum wage. You are going to learn how to take the public bus. You are going to experience the miserable, grueling life you deemed me worthy of living. The absolute reversal of power was entirely intoxicating. I was no longer the anxious, desperate daughter seeking validation from toxic parents. I was no longer the family scapegoat, absorbing their endless insults and cruel jokes. I was a sovereign financial entity. I held the keys to their survival and the locks to their destruction. They had spent my entire life trying to make me feel small, insignificant, and powerless. They had pushed me to the absolute brink of ruin to elevate themselves. They had fundamentally miscalculated. By trying to bury me, they had inadvertently forced me to learn how to dig. They had forced me to become ruthless, resourceful, and utterly unshakable. They created the exact monster that was now standing in their living room, holding the deed to their destruction. I was the sole creditor of their entire lives, and I was about to collect every single debt they owed me with maximum prejudice. David reached into the final compartment of his titanium briefcase. He did not pull out more banking ledgers or forensic analysis reports. Instead, he retrieved 3 thick, stark white envelopes. They were crisp and heavy, carrying the unmistakable weight of official legal service. He handed them to me without a single word, his expression a mask of absolute corporate lethality. I took the envelopes, feeling their smooth, premium surface against my fingertips. This was the exact moment I had been meticulously planning since the day they threw me out into the cold and told me I was a worthless disappointment. I walked slowly toward my father. He watched my every movement with wide, unblinking eyes, like a man strapped to the executioner's chair watching the switch being flipped. I raised my hand and threw the first envelope directly at his chest. It hit his expensive silk tie and fluttered down to the polished hardwood floor, landing right next to the shattered crystal glass. I turned to my right and tossed the second envelope toward Terence. He instinctively caught it against his chest, his breathing ragged and completely uneven. Finally, I walked over to the hallway wall where my mother Brenda was still curled up on the floor. I dropped the third envelope right onto her lap, letting it rest against the fabric of her expensive holiday dress. "Open them!" I commanded, my voice echoing with absolute freezing authority. "Open them right now and read the bold red lettering printed across the top of the page. Do not look away. Do not pretend you do not understand what is happening. Face the brutal reality of your own catastrophic financial decisions." Terence was the first one to tear the heavy paper. His hands were shaking so violently that he nearly ripped the actual legal document in half. He pulled out the thick stack of filings. His eyes darted to the top of the first page. I watched his entire body go completely rigid. The last remaining shred of his arrogant real estate persona instantly evaporated, leaving nothing but a hollow, terrified shell of a man. "It is a notice of default," Terence whispered, staring blindly at the paper as if it were written in a foreign language. "It is a formal declaration of commercial foreclosure." I smiled, a chilling, predatory smile that made my sister Madison physically recoil on the velvet sofa. "That is exactly right, Terence," I said, projecting my voice to ensure every extended family member in the adjoining dining room heard the final, devastating verdict. "When my private equity firm purchased your toxic subprime debt, We also purchased the immediate right to enforce aggressive collection. You have missed your last 6 payments to the shadow lenders. You are entirely in default. That document is the official legal notification that my firm is immediately seizing every single asset attached to your fraudulent name. The condemned apartment buildings, the empty dirt lots, the commercial construction equipment, all of it is officially being foreclosed upon tonight. You are entirely liquidated. You have absolutely nothing left to your name. The fake wealth you used to trap my sister is entirely gone. Terence dropped the papers onto the Persian rug. He stared at his trembling hands completely destroyed. He could not even muster the energy to argue. He knew his fraudulent empire had just been utterly obliterated. I turned my cold gaze back to my father. Richard had slowly knelt down to pick up his envelope. He peeled it open with agonizing slowness, as if trying to delay the inevitable execution. He pulled out the documents and read the header. His chest heaved with a massive, ragged gasp. He closed his eyes tightly, as if trying to wake up from a horrific nightmare. That first document in your hand, Dad, covers your entire commercial restaurant chain, I explained methodically, carving away the last pieces of his fragile ego. You missed your last 4 commercial mortgage payments. The bank was already preparing to seize your properties before I swooped in and bought the debt. I am simply accelerating the timeline. I am calling in the full outstanding balance immediately. Since you do not have the liquid capital to pay me the debt in full, I am legally foreclosing on every single restaurant location. I own the leases. I own the dining rooms. I own the brand you spent your entire life building to impress your snobby friends at the country club. Your entire legacy belongs exclusively to me. Richard let out a pathetic, choked sound. The tyrannical patriarch was completely gone. He was just a broke elderly man losing his entire life's work on Christmas Eve. He slumped forward, resting his forehead against the edge of the bar cart, completely broken. But I saved the absolute best for last, I announced, pivoting on my heels and gesturing broadly to the sprawling, luxurious living room around us. I looked at the massive 12-foot Christmas tree covered in glittering crystal ornaments. I looked at the blazing fireplace, the expensive Persian rugs, and the high vaulted ceilings of the Connecticut mansion my parents had used as a fortress of elitist arrogance for decades. Mom, I said, addressing the sobbing woman on the floor. Look at the second page of your document. Look at the specific property address listed on the foreclosure notice. Brenda let out a high-pitched wailing sob as she read the paper. She clutched it to her chest, rocking back and forth in pure, unfiltered agony. It is this house, Brenda wailed, her voice breaking completely. It is our home. It was your home, I corrected her, my voice slicing through her pathetic crying like a surgical blade. You took out a massive second mortgage on this exact estate to pay for Madison's $100,000 wedding. You leveraged the roof over your own head to buy luxury cars and fake your way into high society. And then you stopped paying the mortgage because you ran out of cash. My firm bought that specific residential debt too. I stepped right into the center of the room, claiming absolute physical and dominant ownership of the space. I am officially foreclosing on this property, I declared, my words ringing with undeniable lethal power. The walls you used to lock me out of your affection are now legally mine. The dining room where you humiliated me tonight is mine. The front door you threatened to throw me out of belongs entirely to me. Madison let out a loud, dramatic shriek, burying her face in the sofa cushions. The reality of losing her childhood home, the ultimate symbol of her golden child status, completely broke her brain. Aunt Patricia and Uncle George sat in stunned silence, witnessing the absolute annihilation of my parents' fake empire. The stark contrast between the joyful, festive holiday decorations and the utter financial ruin unfolding in the living room was incredibly poetic. I looked at Richard, Brenda, and Terence. The vicious predators who had plotted to steal my inheritance and destroy my future were now completely destitute. I had stripped away every single layer of their fraudulent wealth. I had exposed their lies, their crimes, and their desperate fake luxury to the entire extended family. You have exactly 30 days, I stated, delivering the final crushing blow with absolute chilling serenity. You have 30 days to pack whatever cheap personal belongings you have left. and get off my property. When the clock strikes midnight on the 30th day, the local sheriff's department will arrive to physically evict you from the premises. If you attempt to take any fixtures, appliances, or assets that legally belong to the estate, I will have you arrested for theft. I let the silence hang heavily over the room, ensuring the gravity of their new reality settled deep into their bones. You spent 33 years making me feel like a worthless guest in this family, I concluded, my voice dropping to a quiet, lethal whisper. Now you are nothing but trespassers in my house. Your time is officially up. The sheer finality of my 30-day eviction notice hung in the room like a physical weight crushing the air out of their lungs. No one moved a single muscle. The crackling of the fireplace was the only sound breaking the heavy, suffocating silence of their absolute ruin. Then the terrifying reality of imminent homelessness finally penetrated the thick, impenetrable layer of entitlement surrounding my sister. Madison slowly lowered her trembling hands from her face. Her tear-streaked makeup made her look like a shattered porcelain doll that had been violently cracked down the middle. She looked wildly around the luxurious living room, absorbing the catastrophic fact that none of this belonged to her anymore. The designer clothes, the expensive vacations, the fake country club status, the endless stream of unearned privilege, it was all permanently gone. She turned her bloodshot eyes toward the man sitting frozen next to her on the velvet sofa. The man who had promised her a sprawling real estate empire, but delivered nothing except toxic subprime debt and the looming threat of a federal indictment. Terrence tried to shrink back into the cushions, but there was nowhere for him to hide from her explosive wrath. Madison launched herself off the sofa with a guttural scream of pure, unhinged fury. She did not just yell at him. She swung her right arm with every single ounce of strength she possessed. The sharp, violent crack of her palm, striking Terrence across the face, echoed through the entire house like a gunshot. His head snapped forcefully to the side, and a bright red handprint instantly materialized on his dark skin. "You lied to me!" Madison shrieked, her voice tearing through the room with absolute venomous hatred. "You promised me we were rich. You promised me yachts and penthouses in Dubai, and now I'm going to be thrown out onto the freezing street with absolutely nothing because you are a pathetic, broke hustler. You ruined my entire life, you disgusting fraud." Terrence stumbled backward, rubbing his stinging cheek, his eyes burning with humiliated rage. The smooth-talking, sophisticated real estate broker was completely gone, replaced entirely by a cornered, desperate animal. He looked at his hysterical wife and then glared venomously at my parents, who were still paralyzed in their own miserable despair on the floor. "You think I ruined your life?" Terrence spat, his voice dripping with pure, unadulterated disgust. "Your parents are the ones facing a massive federal prison sentence. Your father is a bankrupt restaurant manager who cannot even pay his commercial mortgages. I married into a family of broke, pathetic criminals who used my business to launder stolen trust fund money." He aggressively unbuttoned the cuff of his tailored suit jacket and angrily unclasped the heavy silver watch from his wrist. He held the gleaming timepiece up high in the air as if it were his last remaining shield of masculine pride. "At least I have tangible liquid assets," Terrence sneered, his chest heaving with desperate defiance. "I can take this brand new Rolex your mother just gave me and pawn it for 20 grand tomorrow morning. I will use the cash to hire a decent criminal defense attorney to keep me out of your massive federal fraud case while you all rot in a penitentiary." I could not help it. I let out a sharp, genuine laugh that completely derailed his pathetic attempt at a triumphant exit. I took a slow, deliberate step forward, folding my arms across my chest. "You might want to get that watch appraised by a professional before you try to pawn it, Terrence," I suggested, my voice laced with lethal amusement. I looked down at my mother, who was actively trying to dissolve into the floorboards to escape the incoming humiliation. "Tell him, Mom," I commanded, letting my cold authority wash over her. "Tell your perfect, flawless son-in-law exactly where you purchased his luxurious Christmas present." Brenda squeezed her eyes shut, refusing to speak, burying her face deeper into her hands. When she remained silently weeping on the Persian rug, I gladly delivered the devastating truth myself. "That is not a real Rolex, Terrence," I announced, watching the arrogant defiance slowly drain from his features. It is a highly convincing counterfeit. It is a super clone replica she bought off a shady overseas website for $400 because my parents maxed out their last remaining credit card 3 months ago. They could not afford to buy you a real luxury watch, but they desperately needed you to believe they were still incredibly wealthy so you would not ask questions about where they got the $3 million in collateral. They bought you a fake watch to maintain their fake elite status. Terence stared at the heavy silver watch in his hand, his face contorting in sheer absolute revulsion. The final illusion of the wealthy elite family he thought he had married into completely shattered into a million worthless pieces right in front of his eyes. He realized he was standing in a foreclosed house holding a fake watch surrounded by broke criminals. He let out a disgusted scoff and violently hurled the counterfeit Rolex onto the floor. It smashed against the hardwood, the cheap internal gears and fake glass face shattering outward, scattering tiny worthless pieces across the room. I am officially done with this insane family, Terence roared, stepping aggressively over the broken pieces of his fake pride. He pointed a shaking, furious finger directly at Madison, who was sobbing uncontrollably on the sofa. I am filing for divorce the absolute second the courthouse opens on Monday morning. Do not ever call my phone again. You are entirely on your own. He did not wait for a response. He turned on his heel and stormed out of the living room, his heavy footsteps echoing rapidly down the hallway. The heavy mahogany front door slammed shut with a thunderous, booming crash that literally shook the walls of the mansion, leaving Madison screaming his name into the cold, empty winter night. The alliance of greed had officially devoured itself. The heavy oak front door shuddered violently in its frame from the explosive force of Terence making his cowardly escape. The booming echo reverberated through the massive Connecticut mansion, leaving behind a ringing, deafening silence that felt heavier than solid concrete. Madison let out a final breathless wail before collapsing sideways onto the velvet sofa. Her body curled into a tight fetal position of pure, unadulterated despair, as the reality of her impending poverty crushed her spirit. Her perfect golden child existence had just been entirely vaporized. The extended family members remained entirely frozen in their seats at the formal dining table. Uncle George and Aunt Patricia were too terrified to make a single sound, lest they draw my attention and accidentally become collateral damage in my ruthless financial massacre. My father Richard stood entirely alone in the center of the Persian rug. The man who had spent 33 years meticulously cultivating an aura of absolute invincible authority was suddenly stripped entirely bare. The fake generational wealth, the arrogant masculine bravado, the booming tyrannical voice, it was all violently ripped away. He was left with absolutely nothing but the fragile, terrified shell of an old man facing total, absolute ruin. His legs physically gave out beneath the crushing weight of his colossal debts. I watched with detached clinical fascination as his knees buckled and hit the polished hardwood floor with a dull, heavy thud. He did not try to catch himself. He simply collapsed under the terrifying realization that his entire commercial restaurant chain and his personal legacy were legally gone forever. A fraction of a second later, my mother Brenda followed him down into the dirt. The cruel, vain woman who had spent the entire evening sipping expensive champagne and publicly mocking my career sank heavily to the floor. Her expensive holiday gown pooled around her in a pathetic, wrinkled heap. The sheer paralyzing terror of impending homelessness and severe federal investigations completely broke whatever fragile, toxic pride they had left. The illusion of their high society dominance was permanently shattered into a million worthless pieces scattered across the floor of a house they no longer legally owned. They scrambled frantically across the floor on their hands and knees, crawling toward me like desperate, starving beggars pleading for their survival. Richard reached out his trembling, sweating hands, gripping the fabric of my dress, while Brenda lunged forward and desperately wrapped her arms tightly around my legs. They buried their tear-streaked faces against my knees, sobbing with a loud, hysterical panic that bordered on pure, absolute madness. They had spent decades treating me like dirt on their expensive shoes, but now they were literally groveling at my feet. Gemma, please. Richard wailed, his voice entirely unrecognizable, a high-pitched sound of pure agonizing desperation. I am begging you. I am your father. I raised you. You cannot do this to us. We will lose absolutely everything we have ever built. We will be sleeping on the freezing streets. Please, my beautiful, brilliant girl, show us some mercy. We are so incredibly sorry for everything we did. Brenda tightened her painful grip on my ankles, her thick, dark mascara running down her cheeks and soaking through the hem of my dress. We love you, Gemma. Brenda sobbed, choking on her own frantic, rapid breaths. We made a terrible, horrible mistake, but we are still your family. You are our flesh and blood. You have a good, pure heart. You have always been so kind and forgiving to everyone. Please do not take our home away from us. I will do anything you want. I will get on my knees and scrub your floors every single day. Just please do not throw us out into the cold. I looked down at the two pathetic people who had brought me into this world. I looked at the parents who had systemically destroyed my self-esteem, who had forged my legal signature to steal my grandfather's trust fund, and who had laughed directly in my face when I begged them for financial help to survive. I searched my heart looking for a single ounce of pity. I looked for a microscopic trace of daughterly affection or even a brief flickering moment of regret. There was absolutely nothing there. The emotional well was entirely bone dry. My heart had completely flatlined when it came to these toxic, manipulative people. I looked at them with the cold, dead eyes of an absolute stranger. They were no longer my parents. They were simply defaulted debtors crying over their legally foreclosed assets. I did not yell at them. I did not kick them away in anger. I simply reached down and grabbed Richard by the wrists, prying his trembling fingers off my dress with brutal, effortless strength. I took a deliberate, powerful step backward, physically severing the very last tie of physical contact between us. Brenda fell forward, her hands grasping helplessly at empty air as I moved entirely out of her reach, leaving her sprawling on the rug. David stepped forward seamlessly, anticipating my exact next move. He picked up my tailored wool winter coat from the leather armchair where I had draped it earlier this evening. He held it open for me, his posture radiating unwavering support and lethal corporate dominance. I slipped my arms into the heavy, warm wool sleeves, adjusting my collar with slow, methodical precision. I smoothed my hair and picked up my designer handbag, preparing to leave the toxic blast zone of my own meticulous making. I looked down at them one last time. They were huddled together on the floor, a pathetic, miserable portrait of total self-inflicted destruction. I reached into the side pocket of my handbag and pulled out a single folded piece of paper. It was not a legal document or a foreclosure notice. It was a simple, itemized receipt. I let it flutter down through the air, watching it land gently on the Persian rug, right between my weeping parents' hands. I suggest you dry your fake tears and read that invoice I stated, my voice ringing with a calm, terrifying finality. That is the final bill from the elite catering company you hired to serve your extended family tonight. You ordered premium steaks, imported lobster, and vintage champagne to prove to everyone how incredibly wealthy you are. The total comes to exactly $4,500. Richard stared blindly at the piece of paper, unable to comprehend why I was handing him a catering bill in the middle of his absolute financial execution. You need to pay that invoice first thing tomorrow morning, I instructed, my tone entirely devoid of any mercy. Because at precisely 8 o'clock tomorrow morning, my corporate acquisition team is issuing a hard global freeze on every single line of credit attached to your commercial and residential profiles. Your platinum credit cards will permanently decline. Your bank accounts will be entirely locked. You will not have access to a single liquid penny by tomorrow afternoon. I linked my arm through David's elbow, holding him securely. The warmth of his steady presence was the only real, authentic thing in this entire fraudulent house. Merry Christmas. Mom and Dad, I said, delivering my final goodbye with a chilling, serene smile. Enjoy the 30 days you have left in my house. I strongly suggest you start packing your cheap belongings tonight. I turned my back on them and walked toward the grand mahogany front door. I did not look back at my sobbing mother. I did not look back at my broken father or my weeping sister. David opened the heavy door, and a blast of freezing winter air rushed into the foyer. We stepped out into the crisp, dark night, leaving the smoldering ruins of their fake elite empire entirely behind us. The heavy door closed with a loud, definitive click, sealing their catastrophic fate and officially ending my 33-year nightmare. 6 months have passed since that freezing December night, when I walked out of the Connecticut mansion and locked the heavy oak door behind me. Half a year is not a very long time in the grand scheme of a lifetime, but it is more than enough time to completely obliterate an empire built entirely on lies. The 30-day eviction notice I handed my parents was not a bluff. When the clock struck midnight on the 30th day, they refused to leave, hoping I would somehow show them a shred of last-minute mercy. I did not. The local sheriff's department arrived at dawn with an official court order and physically removed them from the premises. Richard and Brenda were utterly stripped of their fraudulent wealth and completely exiled from the elite society they had sacrificed my future to impress. They now live in a cramped, dilapidated one-bedroom apartment in a decaying suburb miles away from their former glory. The country club board instantly permanently revoked their membership the moment the news of their massive commercial foreclosure went public. Their wealthy friends, the same people who used to drink their expensive vintage champagne at lavish dinner parties, now actively cross the street to avoid making eye contact with them. Richard spends his days sitting on a cheap, sagging sofa, staring blankly at a small television, mourning the total destruction of his restaurant legacy. Brenda, the woman who once bragged about her designer wardrobe and mocked my career, now relies on strict budget grocery shopping and discounted generic brands. They have absolutely no assets, no social standing, and no one left to manipulate. They are entirely invisible to the world. Madison experienced an equally brutal collision with reality. When Terrence stormed out of the living room that Christmas Eve, he never came back. He filed for a ruthless, expedited divorce and immediately fled the state to escape the crushing weight of his toxic subprime debt. He is currently a fugitive, constantly moving from cheap motel to cheap motel, actively hiding from a relentless swarm of court process servers and aggressive debt collectors. He is facing multiple civil lawsuits and a looming federal indictment for his predatory lending schemes. Without her fraudulent husband to fund her lavish lifestyle, and without her bankrupt parents to bail her out, Madison hit absolute rock bottom. The precious golden child who used to parade around with luxury handbags and mock my work ethic was forcefully, violently dragged into the real world. She is currently working 40 hours a week as a retail cashier at a massive discount supermarket. The girl who demanded first-class flights to Dubai now wears a stiff, scratchy polyester uniform and stands on her feet all day scanning barcodes. She spends her entire shift taking orders from impatient managers and enduring the harsh complaints of rude customers fighting over expired coupons. She is completely isolated, trapped in a grueling cycle of minimum wage survival that she used to deeply, deeply despise. The absolute irony of her new miserable existence is a perfect poetic justice. While their world crumbled into fine dust, my world completely blossomed into something extraordinary. I did not spend a single second looking back at the wreckage of their lives. Instead, I focused entirely on building a beautiful, authentic future, with the man who stood fearlessly by my side when the battle lines were drawn. Yesterday afternoon, David and I were married. We did not host a stressful, chaotic event in a pretentious country club to impress fake friends. We hosted a stunning, intimate ceremony right on the expansive wooden deck of the Aspen ski villa, the exact same $5 million estate my mother had so desperately tried to steal from me. The crisp, clean mountain air filled my lungs, and the majestic snow-capped peaks provided the perfect, breathtaking backdrop for our vows. There was not a single drop of toxic blood at my wedding. Not one biological relative received an invitation, but the venue was absolutely overflowing with genuine warmth, loud, joyous laughter, and pure, unadulterated love. The guest list was entirely comprised of my chosen family. I was surrounded by the brilliant software developers who helped me build my technology platform from the ground up. I was celebrated by the elite legal team who helped me secure my financial empire. I was cheered on by the Silicon Valley executives who recognized my true value and treated me as an equal partner. I walked down the aisle feeling completely incredibly whole, surrounded only by people who respected my mind and honored my spirit. I used a significant portion of my immense wealth to establish a brand new, highly specialized venture capital fund. I designed this financial institution with one singular, uncompromising mission. We provide massive, unrestricted startup capital exclusively to brilliant female entrepreneurs who have been financially cut off, emotionally abused, or entirely abandoned by their own toxic families. I am actively taking the immense power my grandfather gave me and using it to build a formidable army of fiercely independent women. I am ensuring that no talented, driven woman ever has to beg a manipulative parent for a loan or endure suffocating emotional abuse just to achieve her professional dreams. That Christmas Eve, my mother called me a disappointment because I did not have a gift. She was absolutely right. I bought back my own dignity, and I gave them the only gift they truly deserved: the naked truth and the devastating consequences of their own greed. Society often conditions us to believe that blood ties demand unconditional loyalty and infinite forgiveness. However, the story we just witnessed shatters this dangerous illusion completely. True family is not determined by shared genetics or a common last name. It is built on a foundation of mutual respect, unwavering support, and genuine love. When the people who are supposed to protect you choose to exploit and manipulate you, instead, they forfeit the right to be called family. Tolerating financial and emotional abuse just to keep the peace only empowers the abusers to destroy your future. The most profound lesson here is that absolute financial and emotional independence is your greatest weapon. You cannot negotiate with toxic, narcissistic individuals who only view you as a stepping stone for their own greedy ambitions. By silently focusing on self-improvement and building her own wealth, the protagonist created an impenetrable fortress around her life. She did not seek petty revenge through screaming matches or physical violence. She simply allowed the natural, devastating consequences of their own fraudulent choices to consume them entirely. Success achieved through honest hard work will always outlast the fragile fake empires built on lies and stolen assets. Ultimately, you must define your own worth. If you spend your entire life desperately seeking validation from people who are committed to misunderstanding you, you will only find misery. Walking away from a toxic environment is not an act of weakness or betrayal. It is the ultimate act of self-preservation and self-love. You have the absolute right to cut off anyone who threatens your peace and to build a chosen family that truly celebrates your brilliant potential. If this story inspired you to stand up for your own worth and cut ties with toxic negativity, please hit the like button and subscribe for more empowering content.